Ladies and gentlemen, members of the public, welcome to a regular business meeting of the Deschutes Planning Commission on July the 8th, 2021 at 5:30. And I have Vice Chair Curis in the room with me, and Dale Crawford and Susan Altman, and also Steve Swisher on Zoom, and I presume you can all hear me. Good, thank you very much indeed, in which case, let me call the meeting to order and let us go first to the approval of the minutes that have been circulated by our recording secretary of the meeting on the 24th of June, 2021. You will have had the opportunity, as I did myself, to submit any corrections. There were not, to my knowledge, any major ones. Any additional comments, corrections, or anything like that that you wish to make to the minutes of the 24th of June? And I think all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us were actually at that meeting. Is that correct? In which case I'd be pleased to have a motion to accept the minutes, there being no objections.
I so move. This is Susan.
Thank you. And may I have a seconder?
I'll second it.
A voice from the corner. Thank you very much indeed. And let's then move to the first item, which is public comments. Isla, do we have any members of the public on board, either Zoom or telephone? Seeing none, then we will move to marijuana retail and reporting text amendments, a work session in preparation for a public hearing, I presume. And it is Tanya Saltzman, please.
Good evening, commissioners. It's nice to see two people in person. I'm not quite sure where to look, but I will just look forward.
Let me just remind you, last time we had Dale Crawford here. We don't want to offend him. He is also a person.
Yes, noted. For the record, Tanya Saltzman, senior planner. I'm here for a work session in preparation for a public hearing that is scheduled for 2 weeks from today on July 22nd concerning legislative amendments regarding marijuana retail hours and annual reporting. This was a little bit different from other processes in that we have come before the Planning Commission as well as the board prior to this to kind of vet the subject in the first place. So this shouldn't be new to most of the commission. There's been really no substantial changes. So I'll be probably pretty brief, but of course, feel free to ask any questions. The proposed amendments are two parts. The first is to extend the permitted hours for marijuana retail businesses in Deschutes County. And the second is to modify the annual reporting requirements. And just for the record, staff spoke with the Planning Commission on May 13th and then had a subsequent discussion with the Board of County Commissioners on May 24th. At that time, the board kind of gave us their blessing to move forward with the formal text amendment process. So here we are. I'll just give a brief summary of these two issues. In terms of the retailing first, the retail hours, there's currently two retailers for marijuana in unincorporated Deschutes County. And I'll preface this by noting that both of these requests came originally from business owners in the marijuana business. So they had reached out to the board and to staff, and that's how this kind of germinated initially. The retailer request was just to extend the retail hours of operation to have greater hours. The proposal at hand, the OLCC, which licenses marijuana retail, as well as production and processing, they allow hours of operation from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. However, when Deschutes County adopted their code with retail hours, those hours were a subset of that, so from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. And the request is to extend those hours to match those OLCC hours. The retailer who requests this cited several reasons, and I believe one or both of them will probably testify or submit written testimony for the public hearing. They cited competitive disadvantage. A lot of them, or a couple both of them, excuse me, are near city limits. Those city limits of City of Bend and City of Lapine, they have great longer hours. So it might be kind of a couple blocks away. People can utilize these longer hours of other establishments, but with these establishments, because they're in the unincorporated county, they have to adhere to those shorter hours. So that was their main thing. It also extended to being able to employ, people for either more hours or, additional shifts, that type of thing. So it is an employment opportunity as well. So the proposal at hand is changing those hours from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. to the OLCC hours of 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So that's the retail. I'm happy to answer any questions and take a pause there if anyone has any.
So if you remember when this came as a discussion initially with the Planning Commission, there was I think a pretty uniform acceptance that the time was ripe to do this, but let's just check. Any questions or discussion for Tanya, please, on the extending of the retail hours to what the state itself allows? Seeing none, why don't you take a second bit?
Great, thank you. The second one is about annual reporting, and it's not quite as simple as retail, but fairly straightforward. This also came by a request from a marijuana producer to either modify or remove those annual reporting and inspection requirements. If this happened, it would presumably start next year. Just to give a kind of overview of that process, every year we send a letter to all production, processing, and retail businesses in around December with an annual reporting form that they fill out, just saying that their conditions of approval are, everything is the same, that same odor control that are in their conditions of approval, same amount of canopy. It's a 2-page document, excuse me. So they submit that every year. And then usually in the summer, we haven't done it yet this summer, we go out to each site and visit it. Those sites who are growing and licensed, we kind of look at all of those conditions of approval to the best of our ability, knowing that we're not code enforcement people and we're not OLCC people, but does the odor seem to be working? Can you hear the fans, that sort of thing. So verifying those conditions. If people are not yet growing, in other words, they don't yet have their license, presumably they're in the queue for OLCC to receive their license, we just verify that they're not yet growing marijuana to the best of our ability. So in the years 2018, 2019, and 2020, we observed 100% compliance for both the licensed ones and the unlicensed ones. So to our knowledge, everybody's adhering to their conditions of approval. So, and alongside that, OLCC, which is a licensing authority, they do their own inspections. They call them proactive compliance inspections. And they are not necessarily annually. I believe they're as desired. And I don't know exactly how OLCC determines that. I don't think they really reveal that information. But they address some of the same conditions that we do in terms of the amount that you're growing. They measure it slightly differently. It's usually in terms of harvest weight rather than canopy size. They're not looking at it necessarily from the same land use perspective that we are, but they look at things like security cameras and, are you disposing of your waste properly, which we also look at. So the argument from the producer who suggested this is that it's a little bit redundant and it causes it's additional workload for both staff as well as the people at those facilities, because they often have to kind of take time to stop and tour someone around. You have to sign in. It's kind of secure in certain cases. And that's the impetus for that. So the actual text amendment itself is quite simple. We add the words "if requested" into the phrase that says, "An annual report shall be submitted, if requested, to the Community Development Department." And then we explain all of the annual reporting. So this gives the Board of County Commissioners discretion in terms of if they want to request it or not.
So the requester would be the county?
It would be the Board of County Commissioners, yes.
Could you be explicit on that, or do you think it wouldn't help?
Sorry?
So rather than just saying if requested, could you say if requested by the Board of County Commissioners?
Oh, in the actual text amendment. I believe that would be acceptable. Yeah. So that's basically it in terms of the actual text amendments themselves. We have a findings document that goes into the background of why these all comply with the comprehensive plan and the statewide goals. And that's the basis for all of it. So, yeah.
So a couple of things, and then we should probably have a discussion on this, because in fact, I think the general feeling last time when this was discussed at the Planning Commission that maybe it was better just to leave it as it is. So the inspecting authorities, one is the county, and that is by appointment, or is it without?
It is by appointment.
Okay.
It's usually staff. It's been me in the past. It's been other planning staff, not code enforcement. And we do have to schedule it because often it's secure or there's gates and things like that. So it's not.
And the other inspecting authority is the
OLCC.
Right, the Oregon Liquor Control Commission.
Correct.
And they also are by appointment?
I am not entirely sure on that. I think they have to give some notice just for the same reasons, but they're not saying necessarily, okay, we'll be there October 1st on this day. And I can double check on that for sure. Okay. I think in general, they're a lot busier. They have a lot of, so that it's not on a regular schedule the way ours are. I know that they do it, but I can get more details on that for sure.
And then I guess the third thing, just to go back through the record, when we were talking about hemp, we had a lot of discussion, particularly from the detective who very kindly attended, that a hemp license is sometimes, often, frequently, I'm not sure we have numbers, being used to cloak a marijuana grow. This text amendment would have nothing to do with that anyway, because those are not premises which the county would have been inspecting in any case.
Is that correct? Absolutely correct, right?
Okay.
We are only inspecting those who have county land use approval to grow or process recreational marijuana. So if you have hemp, we're not going there, really.
Right. Yeah. Commissioners, let me throw it open, please. Any questions, comments on the amendments, and indeed anything related to dropping the inspection? Commissioner Crawford, please.
Yes, a question for Tanya. Do you have any kind of estimate on the amount of time or cost to the county to perform these inspections?
No, but I could probably derive that. I will say that this year we have I think we're going to have about 35 inspections. So it involves reaching out by phone, coordinating the logistics, then the actual travel. So it's probably a few hours each, I would say. And I could quantify that. And sorry, I'm looking at all the TVs and get you some specific numbers about that.
Mr. Chairman, Nick Lelak, Community Development Director. We actually provided an estimate of that when we developed the fee initially, when Tanya was not involved in the project. And I think the fee now, Peter can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about $800 per inspection. And that fee was derived on estimates of reviewing our fully loaded rate, a couple of staff members reviewing the current application, scheduling the inspection. Most of the inspections do take up to a couple of hours, depending on their location. Unlike if we were in the city of Bend, we're not just driving across town, although the traffic across town may take the same amount of time. But now driving to the remote areas of the county can take some time, and then conducting the inspections, coming back, documenting those inspections, completing the report. And it is also our fully loaded rate. So it covers our vehicle, our computers, all of the associated equipment. So I know in the initial years, we anticipated it being requiring more time, more staff resources, et cetera, because they were the start. And then as we progressed, I think we've all become more efficient. And sometimes now we will only send one staff member as our staff has developed relationships with the businesses. And so it's a much more streamlined process. But still, the costs are intended to just be strictly a cost of service that we're providing.
And just to piggyback on that, we only ask for fees from those who are licensed. So
yeah,
we're getting them for about half, a little less than half of those 34, 35 people.
Yeah.
Because it's a simpler process in terms of once you're actually at the property for those who aren't licensed, still all the same administrative stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, very important clarification. Thank you. Because for those that aren't licensed, we're assuming that they're not operating. And if they are, then there'll be a complaint and then we'll address that separately. Yeah, thank you.
Dale, any comeback on that, please?
Yes, just to make sure I understand this. So is the producer, grower, processor, whatever, are they assessed the approximately $800 fee for each annual inspection by the county?
If they are licensed, then yes, every year they have to pay that.
So if I was a producer, I would be I would be concerned about that fee and also the redundancy. And I guess I didn't know about this fee last time we talked about this. I am concerned about us giving up the potential for inspections and how that would look to the general population. But I'm also concerned about the $800 per inspection fee that goes to the county. So that's just a couple concerns that I have that I will want to mull over in my mind.
Please,
Chairman.
Commissioner, sure, go ahead.
Last time, I had some concerns that I expressed, just whether we should or shouldn't do away with the inspections. Tonight, I heard from Tanya that phrase of just adding a couple of words upon request by the county commissioners. That has allayed many of my concerns. As long as we still have the ability to enforce and ask for the same issue, whether there's issues or perceived issues going on, as long as the county has a possibility of doing that, I feel much better about this than I did when I first heard it. So in any event, and then it goes to Commissioner Crawford's comments just about, well, what's the cost really involved here and who's bearing it to do business. So in any event, I feel much better than I did last time I heard it.
Okay, so remember, the request by the county commissioners is not necessarily part of the amendment. It's only a suggestion. And I don't know how you decide that. Presumably it would also, if requested, it would also carry the fully loaded fee.
Right, but you can hear from my comments what I would ask to be included or move to be included when we get to that point.
And commissioners, I would suggest that we not include the fee as part of your deliberations. The planning commission's role is in the text amendments. The board of commissioners' role is in determining how our operations are funded and the resources that are necessary to carry out those operations. I will state two things. One, the purpose of the hearing is going to be interesting as we engage in the marijuana industry so that they can participate, so that they can also offer other language in addition to if requested. Is there a better way to say that? Is clarity preferable? Is there more certainty? Whether, how long before they have to submit those reports? Would they be notified in October prior to a January filing, as opposed to a December, we need the report next month? I mean, I think some of that clarity we'll need to flesh out in the public hearing process. I think one of the other things that you may hear from the industry, and this isn't the public hearing, we're just preparing for you, but one of the reasons for the proposal, it wasn't about the cost. And the request came directly to me, and we've talked to them as well. But it wasn't so much the fee as it was just the logistics. It was their time preparing that report. It was their time coordinating with our staff, and their feeling that they are in compliance. So why are we doing this every year? So I really hope we have some of their participation in your hearing in a couple of weeks, and we'll be sure to make sure that they're aware of it and notified of it. And if for any reason here we are in the middle of summer, if they're not able to participate, we would just respectfully request that the hearing be continued to such a time that they are, a couple of weeks or a month, so that they can participate. Because I do want you to, and all of us, to hear from them.
If they could let us know, I guess. Yeah. Very good. Excellent. Any other comments from commissioners? Please go ahead, Commissioner Altman.
Thank you, Chair Hudson. I did make a couple, no, I'm just trying to get to my PDF. I agree with actually your comment. That was to be my question or comment as well about the proposed text amendment, that it should be more specific if requested by whom, if it's the county commissioners, or just to be more specific with that. And I also agree with what Nick is saying, is there should probably be a timeline. And so I look forward to the discussion from the community about what they would say about that. My only other question, and this may be something that Nick could answer, is later in that sentence, if requested, to the Community Development Department by the real property owner or licensee. I'm just wondering if it should be an and/or thing, because isn't the property owner also responsible to a certain extent for what happens on their property? And they may lease it out for growing purposes, but ultimately, do they carry the responsibility for what happens there?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't thought about whether it should be the and or, but I'm sure that I would expect that would be fine, and we can check with legal counsel as well.
We can clarify that
we can
before we
clarify that.
come to our deliberations.
Exactly.
That'd be good.
That's a
Good
great
point there,
question.
Susan. Thank you. Okay. Final wrap up. Steve, are you back again, or are you okay? I saw your hand twitch. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Tanya, did you get what you need?
Yes, very much.
Have we a date yet for the public hearing?
July 22nd,
Yes.
2 weeks from today.
Did we already know that? And so I guess a special request for input from the marijuana growers, particularly if they can't make that date in time. Yeah, good. Okay, very good. So let's move to item number 6, please. Natural Resources Stewardship Position. Kyle Collins is a report. And actually, Kyle, a lot of work you put into it. Good report. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Commissioners. For the record, Kyle Collins, Associate Planner. I've actually got a presentation that it'll pull up and I can run through. So this will be a discussion item for an item that was included in the 2020-2021 annual work plan at the request of a private citizen. This is a follow-up to a Board of County Commissioners discussion that occurred last Monday around the same topic, but I've included a little bit of the board discussion in this presentation as well to give you some of their thoughts, and then we can just have an open conversation.
Would you be okay, Kyle? Because I noticed you got sort of 3 relatively different positions.
Mm-hmm.
If in fact any of the commissioners have something which is pressing, that we will take questions as you go through, if that's all right.
Absolutely. I would say, yeah, if you have any questions about kind of my process getting to this point or anything in general, feel free to stop me.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
So as I pointed out earlier, this was included as an item on the last year's annual work plan at the request of a community member. And specifically that request wanted the county to tackle multiple issues that are specifically related to natural resource stewardship, either on county-owned lands, private lands across the county, or various conditions of approval from land use decisions that the county is involved with that deal in natural resource issues. Now, there's a little bit of an obvious impasse that comes up with this, which is natural resources, and the concept of natural resource stewardship is obviously quite broad. I'm sure most of the commissioners are aware of that. It could factor into everything from agriculture and forestry, things like natural hazards, open space, wildlife habitat. It's really as big as you want to make the list. You could probably fit it under the umbrella of natural resources and their stewardship. And currently, almost every county department does interact with natural resources in some form or fashion. Some of them are more direct, some of them are very indirect. But some of the current things that we deal in are wildfire hazard mitigation. That's a big one on everyone's mind. Land use review for development that occurs adjacent to sensitive natural areas. So things like river corridors or jurisdictional wetlands. And then technical assistance is often provided for private citizens when they're undergoing projects that are going to affect natural resources in some way or way. So in order to put some guardrails on this terminology and guide the discussion a little bit further, I undertook a series of interviews with a number of committees as well as private individuals to gain an idea of what a natural resource stewardship position might actually look like. The interviews looked primarily at county staff that already work in a direct relationship to natural resource issues, as well as staff members from other counties that work in these areas, and then a few committees that undergo natural resource stewardship that do not work directly for Deschutes County. This is a list of the interviews that we undertook. So you can see Ed Keith, our county forester, is on there. Also spoke with our county property manager, Christy Bollinger. The Deschutes Soil and Water Conservation District was one of our interview members. Commissioner Altman was actually a part of that interview process. And the final two were members from outside of our region. So Tim DeBoot is from Crook County. He works as their natural resources manager. And then Sean Curtis works in Modoc County, which is in North California, and he has a title of Director of Natural Resources. So in addition to the interviews we performed, actually looked over a number of positions that occur both statewide as well as across the country that deal in some way with natural resource stewardship. This is just a list here. You can see of a few of the different things that I actually research. Some of them are specific positions that work in places like county and city governments. Some of them are more like advisory committees that serve in an informational role to serve decision makers. But in some form or fashion, they all are involved in natural resource stewardship, or sustainability is often a term that gets thrown into these positions as well. So after looking through all of the information from the interviews and this research, came up with a few different big decision points. The first is the actual location that any new position might be housed. The reason that's important is whatever department a new position, if one were adopted, is located, is likely to drive the kinds of duties that they're going to undertake. So whatever, if you happen to be located in the community development department, you're going to have very different duties than someone that might be located in the property management department, for example. There's really three broad options that I found that are probably the most fitting. The first is our natural resources department, fittingly. The second is the community development department, which houses a lot of our general planning and building concerns. And the third is the property management department. So each of those has some specific advantages and disadvantages, and ultimately which of those departments would be chosen if a position were created could only house certain types of duties. So for example, if this were a position created under the natural resources department, it would probably have a certain set of duties that wouldn't fall under jurisdiction of the community development department and vice versa. And ultimately, those three are just what I believed, looking over my research, were the most obvious. So obviously the board, if they wanted to move forward with a position of this type, they could elect to find another department to house this position, or it might be simply creating a set of duties across existing staff in a variety of different departments. So that's another option. The second big decision point is the actual duties that are undertaken. So obviously we have to come up with duties that a natural resource stewardship position is actually going to do in their day-to-day basis. And ultimately that needs to be considered in tandem, again, with whatever department they're located in, as that's likely to drive the types of duties. But again, given the very diverse nature of what natural resources are and what natural resource stewardship could mean, it's unlikely that one position is going to cover all the possible issues related to natural resources in a region. And so to manage expectations, again, I've tried to break it down into three general categories. The first one that seems relevant is development review and compliance. The second broad category is property maintenance and restoration, and that's dealing specifically with county-owned properties. And then the last option is a public agency natural resource liaison. That third option, I'll explain it to the Planning Commission here tonight. That would actually drew the least amount of enthusiasm, I would say, from the board during our discussion last week, but just for informational purposes, I've included it here. Some of those categories that I just described largely align with what was proposed in the annual work plan, but some of them are quite different. They don't align at all ultimately with the citizen work plan request. And again, that has to do with the nature of natural resources being a very broad discussion point and category. So the duties themselves also are likely to have either high contact with private property owners in a region or effectively no contact with private property owners in our region. And whichever category they fall into is likely to drive another kind of subset of duties, which is if they are going to have any interaction with private citizens, they're probably going to take on either a regulatory and oversight approach or a non-regulatory technical advisory and educational approach. So again, if you're dealing with private citizens, you're probably going to fall mostly into one of these two categories. Just to relate it back to the job that we do in the planning division, we do provide education and technical assistance to property owners, but a vast majority of our time really is dedicated towards development review and compliance with existing rules and policies that are in place. So the first one, the development review and compliance duties. It's likely going to be located in either, again, the community development department or the natural resources department. And it's, again, primarily going to be regulatory in function with a few educational components. Presumably, this would assist with existing duties that are performed by county departments, such as planning or building, things like land use review. For example, we often have specific requirements written into our code that involves technical expertise from outside parties, things like wildlife biologists in certain instances, forestry experts in other instances. And so this position presumably would be an in-house person to assist with those types of analysis. The second broad item that they might help with is the maintenance of existing either conditions of approval associated with land use decisions, things like that, or legal agreements that the county has entered into. This was a big point of discussion during last week's meeting with the board. The county is a signatory on a fairly high number of conservation easements all across the county. Almost all of them are associated with waterfront properties. We have a specific condition in our code that if you are going to develop a property that has water frontage, you're required to sign a conservation easement for a portion of land that's adjacent to that waterway, and the county is a signatory on those legal agreements. Unfortunately, however, we don't really have a systematic way of tracking those agreements over time. So even though they have a broad variety of conditions associated with them, unless there's a specific code compliance complaint issued, we generally don't follow up on them unless something happens basically that forces them into that position. And so unfortunately, we don't know the exact number of those legal agreements at a present time, although I can give some estimates towards the end of this presentation. And we also don't know what the status of all of those are. And obviously, as properties change hands over time, it gets even more confused because new owners are unlikely to be aware of conditions that may have been entered into 10, 15 years ago.
So, Colin, could I ask you, as a general question, are those, to your knowledge, are those conservation easements entered into via simply the county and the property owner, or are any of them under the general category of syndicated conservation easements?
Generally, it's going to be just between the county and the property owner. So in this case, the most common versions of conservation easements that we enter into as the county being a signatory are associated with our landscape management combining zone. And again, this is almost always associated with major waterways in our region, things like the Deschutes River, the Little Deschutes River, White Juice Creek is another one that comes up. And if a property owner wants to develop let's say they want to build a house on a property with river frontage, they go through a land use review, and a condition of approval associated with that land use review is generally signing this conservation easement and recording it prior to the issuance of any type of building permits. And typically it's for something like 10 feet of land adjacent to the actual water's edge. And it prohibits, obviously, development of any kind, but generally it also prohibits things like vegetation removal, other types of permanent structures being placed there, placement of fill in those areas. It's basically intended to be a no-touch buffer between the remaining portions of the property and the river itself.
Mm-hmm. Do we know whether Oregon, as a state, allows conservation easements to be offered as an investment vehicle?
I I don't know that offhand. I'm sure I could look into that and get some answers. I know there are a number of, for example, land trusts in a region that probably work with conservation easements as a broad tool. And I assume that they probably use those in much the same way as other states do, but I would have to look into it.
Be interesting to know, actually, because it has become quite a hot topic in some circles at the present time as a way of being able to really conduct tax avoidance, I think, more than anything else. Okay, please.
Of course. So the second major duty might be property maintenance and restoration. And as I pointed out earlier, this is specific to Deschutes County owned properties. So this would likely be located in the property management department or possibly the natural resources department. It's not necessarily regulatory or educational in this instance because it doesn't deal directly with private property owners in most cases. It's dealing with parcels of land that the county already owns. And it would assist duties in the property management department, things like actually inventorying all of the county lands, not just the numbers of them, but the actual resources that are located on those properties themselves. So right now, the property management department is actually going through its first ever large scale inventory process to try to gather the exact numbers of parcels and map them out accordingly. They haven't quite gotten there yet. It's quite a large data lift ultimately and mapping process. But even above and beyond that, once they have those numbers in place and some things like values of those lands, they still likely will not know what the individual resources on those properties are. So that might be wildlife resources, it might be agricultural resources, it could be water resources, wetland resources, things of that nature. But at this point in time, there really is no, again, systematic way of tracking those. And so presumably this position, if it had these sets of duties, would assist in that type of broad scale inventory. And then the last general option, again, this was the one the board had the least interest in, is a public agency natural resource liaison. Probably would be located in the natural resources department, and it would serve a primarily educational function, but it mostly would just represent county interests in federal and state land management decisions. So really, it would be a person embedded in the county whose core job would be to review federal land management decisions, let's say a trail creation or a timber sale, something of that effect, and actually offering comments through the federal legal process into NEPA documents primarily and what the county's position was. This really came from the Crook County position and the Modoc County position. That's primarily what both of those persons do. And so that was the reason for inclusion of this category. Some overall general concerns did come up outside of these things that I've drawn out of them that wanted to be pointed out to the board and the Planning Commission. The first was that the county should be aware that they're going to need to explicitly define what natural resource stewardship means if they're going to adopt this position or a series of duties, and use that when implementing these duties across. So it's important to get the terminology correct on the front end, basically, and not try to have this be a scope creep type situation where any project under the sun could ultimately be heaped on to this person or persons deemed a natural resource steward. The second is it's almost certainly going to have to provide public relations and educational components to private citizens in a region. And that's going to be responding to inquiries many of us deal with every day that deal in some type of natural resource stewardship. So whether that's on your own private property, a neighbor's property, the county's property, whatever it is, it would likely be fielding a lot of questions and concerns generally. Third big issue related to water conservation and water use in our region. Obviously, water is a hot topic everywhere on the eastern side of the mountains and in the western states more generally at this point. And it's likely to remain critically important, particularly as our population continues to get bigger and water supplies are feeling the crunch. The last big item related to climate change impacts and options for mitigating those positions, particularly as they relate to population growth in a region, Again, back to water resources and climate change impacts on those. And then finally, natural hazard concerns related to climate change, wildfire being obviously the big one. This position or positions almost certainly will deal with coordination across a range of state and federal agencies. This is just a list of some of our partners that we deal with on effectively a daily basis in the community development department that are also going to involve coordination with any type of natural resource stewardship position. So obviously you can see some state agencies like the Department of Land Conservation and Development, but then some more regional issues like the Soil and Water Conservation District. And coordination across all of these partners, because natural resources are such a broad topic that touches so many different areas, is going to be a huge, huge portion of whatever this position or duties entails. And then going forward into the qualifications that a person or a position like this might have to hold. Almost every person that was interviewed or talked to and the existing positions that I researched were involved in typically the physical sciences in some way. So wildlife biology or ecology were big ones that came up. Things like agronomy or agricultural science were also big hits. And then you go even further into possibly including things like environmental planning or landscape architecture if you're talking about more design focused type projects. A final point relates to compensation. This is obviously very early on in this discussion, and so this is an attempt to drive any type of compensation discussion. So it's likely to be made at a much later date if it's pursued at all. But looking through other positions that have similar types of duties as the ones we've talked about tonight, it's a huge range depending on the background and educational experience that they have, and ultimately the number of projects and duties they undertake. So it really went everywhere from $45,000 a year upwards of $130,000 a year. And then I'll go through some of the board's comments from last week. They raised a number of good questions and concerns that they would like some comment from the Planning Commission here tonight. The first is, are there actually enough stewardship tasks that warrant another employee at the county? Or is this really more of just a series of projects that need to be undertaken by existing county staff or things like a contract? So independent contractors might help us weed through some of these, for example, the inventory of county lands and what those resources on those properties are. Is that an ongoing thing for an embedded employee, or is it simply a one-off project that needs to be undertaken? The same could be said for the tracking of our conservation easements and what stage of compliance those conservation easements are in. Is that, again, an ongoing thing that needs to happen continually, or is it really a one-off instance where we kind of catch up to where we need to be and then push that duty onto existing staff? The second big comment that they came up with was, is there opportunities for partnerships between other groups or agencies within our region to help undertake natural resource stewardship? So they specifically called out the Soil and Water Conservation District as a possible partner, both in terms of getting funding for projects, things like grant funding at either a state or a federal level, or things like the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council to actually go out and help private property owners understand impacts to jurisdictional wetlands or other aquatic resources that they may not be aware that they're actually even creating in some instances. So the board was concerned that it may not be the county's direct role to actually guide these projects, but rather to help coordinate across existing groups who already have their foot in that side of the door. The third item relates specifically to some of these legal agreements that we've spoken about already, the conservation easements, and whether or not we actually have any estimates or maps about where these are. And how many of them may or may not be out of compliance. So I've already told you we do not have a systematic way of tracking these, but we've tried to come up with some estimates to provide to both the Planning Commission and the board here tonight. The estimates are based on our visible landscape management reviews that we've performed over roughly the last 25 years, give or take. And as I stated earlier, the recording of conservation easements is almost always included as a condition of approval within these types of reviews. We have a pretty good feeling that anytime someone receives a visible landscape management review and they're adjacent to a river, that they do actually record these conservation easements. And the reason that is we almost always tag on a specific point of that condition that says thou shalt do this before receiving building permits in any way. And so if they actually want to build whatever the original project was, they'll actually need to come in, show proof that they've recorded this conservation easement with both signatories, someone from the county and then themselves personally. So we know that a lot of these are recorded. We just don't know what state they are in currently. So based on that estimate, we think there are approximately 800 of these in the south half of the county and about 300 of these in the north half of the county. That discrepancy is related to the fact there are more landscape management waterways in the south half of the county. It's possible this is off by, let's say, a few hundred, I think is kind of the range. So there is a fair amount of margin of error there, but we think this is at least a good first order review of how many of these might be floating around in the county. This is a map. It's included in the Planning Commission's packet tonight as well. You can see the red dots here. On the left side, you'll see the north half of the county approximately. And on the right half, you'll see the south half of the county approximately. And those red dots are all properties that have received a visible landscape management review and include a river frontage as well. So you can see the red dots roughly track water courses all across the county. So we assume everywhere that you see a red dot, presumably there is a conservation easement recorded for that lot. Compliance review for each of those recorded easement properties would be a much larger effort. It would involve, at the very least, aerial image review over a number of years to see, for example, if wetland vegetation has been removed from the property, if banks on the property have been altered in any way, things like docks being constructed. There's a number of different things that could possibly happen. And so we could start to get an idea, maybe an estimate percentage-wise of how many of these might be in versus out of compliance, but it really would require a great deal of effort to get anything approaching a very accurate number of that. We're still working through some ideas of how we might do that, but unfortunately, the way these easements are recorded through the Deschutes County Clerk's office, there's really not a good way of searching through that documentation. Even working directly with the clerks, it would basically have to be a property by property basis where we actually go in, see if it's been recorded, and then view the individual property either on the ground through a site visit or through some type of aerial imagery review. So as you can imagine, it's quite a project. And then kind of wrapping up here, as I pointed out a few different times, because this is such a huge topic and there's a number of different items that could fall into this idea of natural resource stewardship, it's not even clear that a single position could actually accomplish all of the duties, even some of the duties that I've outlined here. And so if the county did want to explore either including a position like this or at least exploring putting duties like this across multiple staff members, then may want to think about including multiple different contracts for different projects or hiring just additional staff members that don't necessarily fit natural resource stewardship, but would still work on these types of projects over time. Next steps, staff is going to report back to the board after getting some comments from the Planning Commission here tonight and going through, ideally getting a little bit better information on some of those maps that I discussed earlier, and then hopefully arranging a series of concepts that are based off all of this discussion into a more refined series of action items that the board might undertake. So do they want to adopt a position at all? Do they want to scope out a number of natural resource stewardship projects that might be better left to kind of a case-by-case basis? Or do they not want to move forward until additional information has been gathered in one way or the other? And with that, I will open it up to any questions.
So commissioners, thank you, Kyle, first of all. I think Kyle has given a good expose of the work that he's done and the range of the potential duties and responsibilities that could fall under such a position. For other reasons, I happen to know that actually at the state level, natural resource management falls under 42 different state agencies. So clearly the question is not, what is this post going to do in 20 years' time? The question is, where do you start? Where is the priority? I think with the exception of Susan, who in any case was wearing her other hat for the Soil and Water Conservation District, I think tonight we're going to be giving our comments as representatives of the community. In a sense, Kyle got the county requirements, and I think now we should probably focus primarily on what the community requirements would be for such a position, if at all. And if there is a priority or priorities, what are they? So let me open it for questions for Kyle and also for discussion. So please, whoever wants to lead off, go ahead. Steve Swisher.
Over the past several years, our Planning Commission has had several occasions to talk about conservation easements as we were looking at waterfront properties, as we were discussing floodplains. And in fact, that floodplain discussion took a lot of time and then got revamped again. But as we have done that, one of the overriding concerns that come up, and some of my own personal concerns were, okay, so who really monitors these conservation easements? I mean, is the county really looking at that every year? And we have set some things in motion, and 5 years from now, is it still enforced? Is somebody built a dock on the front and nobody's noticed, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I've heard the discussion tonight, that Kyle has done an excellent job of putting this together. There's a broad range of things it can do, but I think the county is justified in having a position in community development strictly on looking at the conservation easement issues, even if he was off by 100. So that was, I think I heard 500 in the South County and 300 in the North. Let's say he was off by 100 in both of those, 400 and 200. So that's 600 different properties that should be looked at on an ongoing basis. And that would be like 2 a day for somebody working throughout the course of the year. And so you could certainly fill the time with that and providing community education and education to private citizens and those kinds of things that have an interest in developing. So I think there's so much more here. Also, we could go to a variety of different pieces and how it might be added on, but going to work with partner organizations also, like the Soil and Water Conservation District or others. So I see that kind of combination, but I see a person that could really enhance the enforcement of these conservation easements, just having a person doing that, and then continue to look at the further needs that go out, whether it's private contracting, special event kinds of things, or ongoing relationships with particular organizations. So I think there's a combination of both of those that would have to occur to actually fill the needs. So that's based on reading Kyle's report, hearing his comments tonight, and my own history in the past 7 years of sitting through several conversations about these conservation easements and how do they really work.
Can you comment, Steve, just as you brought it up as the first topic, is it monitoring conservation easements actually, first of all, I guess, finding out what those conservation easements actually are? Is that a full-time county position, or is that a contracted out, relatively large effort that wouldn't carry all the downside or expense of a fully funded county position? I think the need is clear. How would you do it though?
Well, either way, there's going to be at least 600 properties, probably more like 800 or 900 properties that are going to have to be monitored. And you can't just monitor them every 10 years. They've got to be ongoing and looked at every year, making sure the compliance is in place. So you can come back and answer your question. That's a great debate about leadership and management. So are you going to have a contracted position doing that, or organization, or are you going to have an employee, which is more financially efficient? I guess commissioners can figure it out, but there's certainly a full-time equivalency needed somewhere to take care of that function.
The one person, 600 positions. I think even Tanya Saltzman may actually find that problematic. Any other comments, please?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
In response to the board's questions about, like, how do we think about this? Do we think about this as, getting contractors or projects that existing staff could do? I think those are actually really good questions. One reason why I think it's really important that this has a dedicated position is because I think that there's a lot to be gained from having a person who can develop over the time that they hold that position, kind of a broad view of, what are we doing with our natural resource stewardship? Where are we going with this? I think, like, if you're just contracted for a project, you're probably going to do a really good job with that project, and you probably will think about, where does this fit in the big picture? But if it's your job to look at it, like, where does this fit in the big picture? I think that could be really valuable, just with the rate that things are growing here and the rate that the environment's changing and is impacted. So I think that there's an argument to be made for it having its own dedicated position, rather than, if all other things are equal, rather than having people work on it piecemeal, whether it's existing county employees or contractors.
So this is a natural resources management person rather than any specific one at this stage you're suggesting? Any specific of those huge lists that we saw?
Correct. Yeah, it seemed like some of the board's questions were kind of about, should we have this, do we need to have this as a position, or can we get the projects done in other ways? And I'm saying I'm in favor of having it as a position for
There should be an advocate who is thinking about this, who is qualified to do this.
Right.
And can bring the expertise that actually the rest of the county could benefit from.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think obviously there's incredibly skilled planners around here. No shortage of great planning abilities, but to be able to combine long-term planning type thinking with the expertise in that specific area of science, like whether it's a biologist or any of the other professions that were on the list, I just think that could be a really winning combination. Okay, that concludes my comments.
So let me just check. That wasn't somebody trying to get in to make a comment, Isla, was it?
I think it was Dale's background.
Oh, go ahead, Dale, please. Can you unmute, please? Dale?
Dale, you're muted.
Can you unmute?
Am I unmuted now?
That's good. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. The term natural resources stewardship is pretty encompassing, and I'm not opposed to having a position, but I think before we have a position, we really need to define what that position is and have to have it narrowed down. Otherwise, I'm really concerned that it's going to be all over the place. And I guess if I was the person looking at that position, I'd want to know what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm not sure that's been defined yet. I think it's more than just water. When you talk about natural resources, there's lots of things that are involved. So as Steve said, one person could spend all their time dealing with the water issue. But before I put my vote of confidence in this, I'd like to see a description of what we're really talking about, a definition for the position.
Good point. Susan, wearing your citizen hat rather than any of the other two, please.
I have a number of questions / comments. So I agree with Commissioner Kiris that I support this being a position of its own. I also understand and agree with what Commissioner Swisher is saying, because to do conservation easements and look at them from the perspective of, are people keeping up with them? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? You know, where do they stand? That could absolutely, I think, be a full-time job, because it's more than just going out and, you know, maybe looking at a property. I'm sure there would be a lot of research involved for each property. And so that itself could be a full-time job. With regard to some things that Kyle had put in his presentation, I was wondering, what was the original idea or proposed job description that was submitted by the public person who requested it? Did they have a thought of their own as to what they wanted to see, or was it just like, you should do this, and so the county said, okay, we'll look at it? What was the original idea there?
Job description necessarily, but what was the priority or the incident that actually brought? Would that be okay, Susan?
Yeah, I'm just
I mean,
wondering.
I doubt whether they gave in a job description.
Right, but I'm curious, where did that person see this going? What was their specific request, aside from the county should have a natural resources position?
So I would say they focused on a few different areas, and they're kind of in different baskets, I would say. But the first big area was the actual maintenance of county-owned properties that have sensitive natural resources. So the county has some fairly large properties in some instances, some with very valuable assets, river frontages, portions along the Deschutes River Canyon, things like that they wanted to see maintained in a proper way. Some of them might need actual management plans dedicated for individual lots so that persons could start to access these on a public basis, possibly, or at the very least to avoid degradation of those properties that are effectively not being managed at all outside of specific, let's say, fire mitigation standards for certain lots. So that was kind of one bucket. The second bucket fell more into this maintenance of county land use decisions or compliance of county land use decisions that involve natural resources. So the conservation easements, for example, that's one big one that fell into this particular citizen's concerns. But it actually goes much broader than that. So that's just one example of conditions of approval or things that we evaluate when approving or denying development in Deschutes County that involves natural resources. So for example, if you were to build a property, let's say, is in the wildlife area combining zone, which is one of our big overlay zones that deals in natural resources. If you're going to build it in certain areas, it has to meet particular requirements. And occasionally that involves things like a wildlife management plan. And those management plans generally are baked into the final land use decisions themselves. It might require vegetation management over a certain period of time. You might actually have to install barriers around certain things. I mean, it could be any number of conditions that might be included in those decisions. And ultimately, again, barring a compliance issue that's specifically brought forward to the county, we generally don't follow up on these. I mean, that's it. That's how the entire code compliance division operates, is on a complaint basis. And so unless somebody brings us an issue with a very specific item that we've approved, we typically don't follow up on this. And I can give a number of different examples how that comes into place. There are vegetation screening standards associated with properties that are built along major roadways or riverways. Those are things that we generally don't follow up on, again, unless there's a complaint or we specifically see a violation. And so there are a number of different items that come up through just community development department. That doesn't even go into other departments that private property owners are required to maintain over, in some cases, indefinitely. And barring a specific incident, we generally don't know if those things are maintained over time. We hope that they do, and we have a legal backing to make sure that they're enforced, but just the sheer number of them would be daunting, and the number only grows every year. So we probably issue, at this point, several hundred just landscape management positions over the last several years. And each of those, in many cases, involves some condition of approval that deals in natural resources.
Sure.
I mean, I think, in general, it would be a massive change in the way the county is staffed if you were to pick up a monitoring and enforcement function rather than a complaint-led code compliance. And it certainly is not to argue that there's not the need. I mean, I heard a comment only last week from one of the big agencies who was responsible for reseeding a massive stretch in Tumalo. And their answer was, well, we were required to plant the seed. We weren't required to make sure it grew because, of course, it all died and it's a desert. So I recognize the problem, and I think your analysis is absolutely on point. Susan, your list. Sorry, Steve, she has a list. Let's go down your list first, and then I'll come back to Commissioner Swisher.
Okay. Well, for the record, I also serve on the board of the Soil and Water Conservation District, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the board, but just also some information that Kyle brought up about partnering with other agencies. The Soil and Water Conservation District is here to serve local landowners and do public outreach and help them with on farm or on their own property needs that they may have. And the district is funded with money from the Oregon Department of Agriculture and other grants from other agencies, and also grants that may be available elsewhere. So our funding is pretty limited as to what we can get done, but our purpose is for outreach, education, and helping people on their properties. And there was some, comment about water obviously is a huge issue, wildfire, wildlife. There are a number of organizations in the county that work on water issues. The Deschutes Basin Board of Control, there's each irrigation district that serves their patrons. And then there's the Deschutes River Conservancy, just to name a few, but there are many more. With regard to compliance, the Soil and Water Conservation District doesn't have anything to do with, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Going after somebody for a compliance problem. If somebody were to bring a compliance issue to us, that would go to the DEQ, and they may address that from a water quality perspective if, let's say, someone has a manure pile that's too close to a creek. So just a brief background on that there. My other question for Kyle is, did you sort of survey each of the three departments that you listed? And did each of them say, ooh, I would love that position, and here's what I could use that person for? So the Natural Resources Department would say, oh, I've really been wanting to do this project, or Community Development says, oh, I would love this, or the property manager says something like this would be great. Did they each have an idea of how they would want to utilize this position?
I would say it's a mix of both. So certain departments had very specific ideas of either ongoing projects or projects that have been thought about for a long time that a position like this might undertake. So property management in particular has this ongoing, I mentioned, inventory of county properties. And the thought here is not only would it help expedite that process in some way, but it might add another level of information to the inventory that might be valuable. So talking about what's actually on these individual properties rather than just the size and the assessed value and the location of where they are. So that's one example where there were very specific ideas, whereas the Natural Resources Department is much more open-ended. I mean, our Natural Resources Department currently only has 2 employees, and both of which are involved almost exclusively in wildfire mitigation. That is really their bread and butter and the only thing that they work on. And so anything that was not related to wildfire mitigation, presumably that's what this person would take on if they were housed in that department. But they didn't have any specific ideas of how they might be folded in to this position.
Do you have any final questions, Commissioner Altman? Commissioner Swisher,
No, thank
please.
you.
I wanted to add a little bit to the history, the impetus of this particular position. Actually, part of this came from the Planning Commission itself. Chair Hudson, I can recall some time ago, planning commissioners making some comments. I think perhaps you did. And then Commissioner Crawford can help with the memory here. And I know Commissioner Palcic did, Some of it stemmed from lower bridge discussions in that particular development and other pieces. And the conversation come up, well, geez, do we have our own expert on staff here at the county to help us deal with this and not listen to one expert hired by a proponent and another expert hired by opponents? Does the county have that resource in their own staff? And that conversation come up a couple of times before. And so everything that Kyle described and whatever the citizen brought forward is in addition. But I want to point out that some of the impetus of this discussion came from the Planning Commission itself.
Yeah, I mean, if I could respond from my past membership, not necessarily from the chair, I think what you're highlighting is indeed a discussion which started even before our lifetime commitment to the floodplain work that we did. And I think the real hot topics that actually drove this, I mean, for me, the first was going to hear a retired fish biologist give testimony, formal testimony, to a county hearing about a piece of property where the deer effectively were being pushed off by housing development. And he unashamedly said, the deer are fine with that. And the county got so much bad comment from that I think, for me at least, that's where I got the general impression the county really is just going to build houses everywhere. Having now obviously been internally, I see it as a much more responsible approach. I think the second is that the wildlife inventory, which Tanya is not here actually for us to be complimentary about her work, but I think she started something there which was very, very important in updating the wildlife inventory. And one sees in general now an increase in particularly large scale development of properties where a wildfire and wildlife management plan has been key in actually tipping public opinion, the commissioner's opinion at the board level, and certainly is seen as important for the county staff. The problem is the plans are all different. They actually use different parameters. Yes, broadly they're the same, but what they're looking at, how they're looking at, whether or not they have any indicator species or events and leading edge indicators are very important if you're trying to actually put one of these plans together. And it was at that point that personally I suggested that some wildlife biology experience would be valuable in the county. And I think, frankly, although it's premature to get any input from our new county commissioner, our new county administrator, the notion, which in fact Kyle didn't explore, but I'm sure he wouldn't rule out of court, is in fact to take the existing natural resources functions, add this new position of a wildlife biologist type expertise, and actually put that into community development, because there would be, I think, combining it into one unit based in community development would give you internal support services, I guess. It would also give a natural cheek by jowl association with these very good planners who, at the time, I've forgotten who it was now that I actually asked, is there any planning expertise that actually has a biology, zoology type background or botany background? And I don't think there was then, and I don't think there is now. So, Steve, I think your memory is perfect. And for me, at least, that would be one of the priority drivers. If you've got that in place, I think the public could well applaud it. And it could be a natural pickup point for the wildlife inventory that the county is currently updating. These are things where I think there's got to be a better mechanism to try and define what the priorities are, because in fact, there are several priorities that are dead easy to put out there. It's just a matter of how you rank them, because that's the person who you appoint first. And then you say to that person, Well, go and talk to the new county administrator and get the other 15 posts that you need.
So it may be helpful. I think a very similar discussion came up in the board's meeting last week in relation to particularly the idea of having an in-house expert in whether it's wildlife biology or something
whatever,
else. And so from a county planning perspective, we interface with experts that are not specifically, let's say, developer focused experts all the time. I mean, we do have processes in place. Let's say you are going to develop near a jurisdictional wetland of some kind. We actually have legal requirements that we interface with the Department of State Lands primarily. They have aquatic biologists on staff. And so it's not as if we're flying blind effectively. There is expertise that we can rely on. One of the issues that comes up is basically once it's past the development stage and let's say you've received a land use approval, there's really, because there's no follow-up and we have no impetus to contact the Department of State Lands in most instances past that point. And that's just one possible example. It's also, we're reliant ultimately on generally state agencies to provide these comments, and occasionally it's more a matter of efficiency than anything. I mean, sometimes these comments from these experts, while very valuable and helpful to us, I mean, they may take upwards of several months ultimately to really get this, whereas it obviously would expedite the process in some way to have an in-house expert, but we would still have to go through the process of contacting the state agencies. And so
I think that's true. And in general, I accept your point. I think we're talking about different things though. We're talking about something where now the ability to produce a management plan for wildfire and for wildlife management has become so key for huge property developments in areas which otherwise would never have been developed. And it's at the cutting edge. There is no agency, there is no hired gun who actually has that expertise, because at most they've bidded to do one of those proposals to the county. And the idea would be the county would actually become a resource for helping people to put in place what the future citizens of the county actually require. So my suggestion is not that you're not taking advice, it's just that advice doesn't exist yet. And if we don't do it, it's not going to be done. It's going to feel a bit like wildfire. You know, here we are 3 years on talking about the problems of wildfire still. Commissioner, Vice Chair, did you want to speak?
Yeah, that was way more efficient than when I'm on the screen. Like I can just go like this. And then,
I heard you.
yeah. Yeah. So what I was going to say is similar to what the chair is saying, but specifically about if we have to choose between enforcing the conservation easements versus managing the county land that we have. I'm actually very excited about both of those options if they end up being options. But I think that we have this discussion a lot about, do we want to react to things or, literally or figuratively put out fires, or do we want to think about how, with an ecologist, you're looking at how everything's interconnected and how everything works together to maintain the land in a long-term sense. And I'm not an ecologist, so I don't know, I wouldn't know exactly which questions to ask to create that plan. But if I were an ecologist, I think I could say, okay, what do we want this land to look like in 50 years? Or what's the healthiest use of this resource? Or how can we maintain this as a resource for the county? And then I could go and ask for the data that I need to do that. Or I could reach out to other agencies and ask them for data or whatnot. But I don't know if it's the same, if you're not an ecologist, I don't know if there are things that you don't know what you don't know. So I think there's something maybe to recommend a person who is at least looking at the county-owned land and saying, this is our land, we own this. Let's make sure it at least stays in good shape over many, many years, rather than having somebody who's not an ecologist or not a biologist say, oh, that looks like that's not going well there. Okay, how do we fix that? Let's call so-and-so, let's contract with somebody or get a grant and get a consultant and figure out how they can help us, because that doesn't look good. So hopefully that point, I'm making the point okay. But to summarize, I would say probably at least managing our own property would be really good. And I also agree with Chair Hudson that at least the public that participates in this meeting, many of those people I think would be very impressed with something like this as a response to their continued concerns that maybe we need to have a long-term plan for our natural resources.
I mean, if I could suggest, so we've now got four, not diametrically opposed, but certainly four full-time jobs, very clearly defined, though not to the level, Susan, of a job description yet, although we do have a salary range. I think what we need to think about, and I hope this is not the last discussion we'll have about this, is how we actually get public input, because the county-owned lands, that may actually be a real priority for the public. We've had a lot of examples where code compliance is very poor. Again, in the floodplain discussions, we had photographs from Google Earth, which basically you can see by looking just how much non-compliant many of those properties are, although there was no mechanism, and it will be a very long piece of work to actually allow us to dig into that. I think the whole area of being able to manage for wildfire, to manage for water, to be able to manage for wildlife, we've got to start somewhere. And I think, you know, if the staff could noodle on how we do that, we have had in the past groups, meetings, town halls, of meetings where we basically have gone out to the public and say, look, we're thinking about this. What do you think the priority really is? And then truly you get public input. I mean, we obviously are representative, but we actually are only 5 people, 2, 4, 6 people, excuse me, that basically in any case have, I think, encompass different parts of what this job description could be. That's a long-winded way of asking you, is that what you wanted from us? Are you happy with what you've got? This is not the end of the road.
This is the very beginning of the road, I would say. Ultimately, this is, as I kind of said at the beginning, this really is an open conversation to figure out. The purpose of my report was to try to put some parameters around what this could be if you wanted to start, let's say, in the next.
And I think you did that very
months.
well, which is great.
Now, obviously, if the commissioners have other ideas, it sounds like some of these ideas are very broad reaching. We're talking about management plans for individual county properties. Those are discussions that also came up before the board. And so I think that the next steps moving forward is to come up with what the Planning Commission might think of as priority examples, either from what I presented or other things that have come up here tonight, for me to bring forward as, I guess you would think of them as quasi plans of how this might be implemented. So if these are different positions, if they are different projects that need to be implemented without hiring a new position, is it a focus on the compliance issues? Is it even a focus within the compliance issues on something as narrowly defined as conservation easement compliance? Or is it something like developing management plans for county-owned properties and making sure that they're maintained over time? That's another broad area that I know the board expressed interest in and the Planning Commission has expressed interest in. Or is this more of an in-house expert to lead discussions around development generally, or maybe not even just development, but any type of natural resource more broadly across the county? And
So I guess, you know, one of the ways we could end this, because this is very open-ended, and unless we went off to the place of public consumption of liquor, we probably will not be able to go on much longer, if you look at packet page 12, you're often, I mean, not you, the county often cites the Deschutes County population forecast. And I'm going to ask a question that Commissioner Swisher asks at least every third meeting, which is, and where's the water going to come from? Because if you would actually plot over that particular bar chart that you've got, the problems that are now arising, irrigation districts having to cut off their water supply in the end of June, people using well water, people using irrigation water for massive landscaping projects, let alone people just trying to drink the stuff. We may actually have been, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, seeing the beginning of a problem which is going to render this moot. And what you really need is somebody who's going to come into the county and at least help the county with its water policy. What do you think, Commissioner Swisher? Do you think it's important or not?
Getting myself unmuted. Yeah, I think that's critical. And obviously every third meeting, I'd probably bring it up every meeting, but you know, that gets old. But yeah, I think it's really important. And to narrow down 2 categories, if we were to look at managing the county properties and then whatever can be done about conservation easement compliance, if you're just looking at a position, and then a third of this person's time still needs to be more visionary, looking at the bigger picture, talking about water, being an expert to help educate ourselves and being that neutral expert with them there. So again, I fully favor hiring the person, and then we still will have to piecemeal out things that goes on in projects and competition, our conversations with partners and so on. So all in all, there's more than enough to fill it. We can hone it down to make it real for that particular person, certainly. But again, those 3 topics that are my priorities, the conservation easement management, managing those county properties. But again, still, this person's got to be a little bit of the leader of the band in this particular area, have enough expertise to be educational and help be that neutral advocate. And of course, at the core of that for me is all about water. So.
Very good. Thank you for that.
Mr. Chairman.
Please go ahead, Nick.
Thank you. If I can just capture what Commissioner Swisher just stated, if that's kind of the will of the Planning Commission, that was a really nice summary of the entire conversation. 2 other points. One is that, that you mentioned, Chair, the Chair mentioned, it's really important that we haven't discussed, and we don't need to discuss it now, but we can in the future. And it's a very important piece of, as Kyle's framed this, could be in one of 3 different departments. Well, the Natural Resources Department today consists of 2 people. They're entirely focused on wildfire. In fact, they're so busy focusing on wildfire that they're transferring this fiscal year now their noxious weed ordinance compliance to our community development department with funding. So they don't have additional capacity. And one of the things you mentioned is we really have the, for lack of a better term, the infrastructure to support a person. We've got our in-house finance, and we've got planning, we've got all the different disciplines, and we really pride ourselves on being a one-stop shop. The property management department at the same time is 2 people as well, and they can't keep up with the demands, with the inquiries, with the property sales, the acquisitions, et cetera. Whereas the community development department really does have the infrastructure to tackle a lot of those issues. And I go back to that one-stop shop. One final time is that, and I think it was Commissioner Altman that mentioned this earlier, is there are so many organizations doing so many things pertaining to natural resources now. One of the great qualities is we would have one person that would be kind of the resource. They wouldn't necessarily do it all, but they would be able to say, to talk to this person or to address this issue, here's the agency, this topic, this person, this region, they could almost be that point person of where to tackle it all. So where we're going to go from here, as Kyle may have mentioned, is we are going to meet with the Board of Commissioners again. This this certainly far exceeded my expectations. I think you've really helped us understand your perspectives as the citizen body, the resident body for this county, which is exactly what we hoped as a starting point that we can then take back to the Board of Commissioners and then to kind of decide the next pieces of it. And I appreciate the jokes about this will be in the next county administrator's hands, and it could very well be in the next community development director's administration. So I'll be happy to share that responsibility.
Sure, you get somebody good. I think you make a very good point in the sense that you start with a limited number of people, which gets you the person power, you get expertise, you get advocates, but more importantly, you get a seat at the table with the people outside. Because the minor part of it is actually the number of people that you have. You have somebody good, and they will become the focus of that. And you shouldn't be led astray by Commissioner Swisher's well-honed skill of repeating his personal priorities and representing it as being the Planning Commissioner's priorities. I think it's an open discussion that we're still having here. And I would still like to see us somehow or other take in evidence or advice from a broader swath of the public. I mean, we have Zoom, we have some very well organized not-for-profit organizations, which should be, I think, at least as important for us to consult with as we would in other, well, certainly internally. Thank you for that. Thank you very much indeed. Nobody was suggesting that the county was flying blind. I would just like to reiterate that and then move, if I may.
Yes, that's true. I was definitely not suggesting that either.
No, he meant me.
Oh, I didn't know. And also that was a really.
No, he always thinks it's me. That's
Oh,
okay. That's fine. That's my role. Thank you, Carr.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we will apprise the Planning Commission once we hear back from the board and any steps moving forward.
Thank you. So rural economic development. Our specialist for transport planning, Peter Russell, item 7.
Morning, Planning Commissioners, or good evening rather. Peter Russell, Senior Transportation Planner. What I'm going to do tonight is kind of walk you through some rural economic development opportunities, discussions we've had with the board, and some white paper research. So I'll start with kind of doing about a half dozen topics at the 30,000 foot level, then recap the discussion we had with the board last week, and then listen to your input and answer any questions you might have. So the first of the 6 is really simple, and that is the state sets the ceiling for land use development on rural properties, meaning under the Oregon revised statutes, Oregon administrative rules, the statewide planning goals, the state's in the driver's seat and says how intense you can be on rural land use. So that's the driver. The county has to be consistent with those. We can be more restrictive, but we can't be less restrictive. So that's how I always describe it as the state sets the ceiling and what kind of land uses can happen on agricultural or forest land. So they like exclusive farm use, forest zone 1, forest zone 2, multiple use agricultural 10, rural residential. State sets the ceiling, which is one of the things we have to tell folks when they come to our counters sometimes and want to do things. Secondly, this white paper is based on small mom and pop operations, not national corporations. One of the things we've heard is from folks who want to, make salsa in their kitchen, or whether they want to have a farm stand, or whether they have some sort of new and unusual agricultural practice that they want to make a living off of, or supplemental income, and whether or not that works into the state. So this all came from our work plan and some of those folks and small farmers asking, well, what can we do for rural economic development opportunities? And the Planning Commission has been interested in that, as has the board. So all of this research paper was organized on what could a small mom and pop do. So I want to keep that as the mindset. That was the second one. The third one, how we accommodate those smaller operations. There's a couple different ways in the 30,000 foot level. One, under zoning, we have what's called commercial activity in conjunction with a farm use. Some things we can look at as processing. Some, if you're bringing folks on site, we can look at limited sales, but commercial activity in conjunction with a farm use is one of the ways that we accommodate these smaller uses, what Commissioner DeBone calls the entrepreneurial spirit types of activities. The other way we do it is we have what are called home occupations. So we have 3 types of home occupations, cleverly labeled type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 is, you don't even know it's there. And type 3 is the most, where it's kind of a business that has a limited number of employees, but all of our zones allow those. And so that's, again, consistent with state rules. So those are your 2 major ways to get there: commercial activity with a farm use or a home occupation. The fourth one, some of the folks had asked about our fees, because they think some of the fees may be a barrier to them to start these small scale operations. So what the county does is we annually look at our fees and we try and set them so that they're commensurate with the level of staff work needed to review and make a decision on the land use application before us. So obviously, if it's something that's outright permitted, those fees tend to be a little lower because there's not much discretion involved, or as much. If it's a conditional use permit, then we've got to do code interpretation, apply discretion. There may be public notices. So we try and make sure that our fees are commensurate with the staff level and public notice requirements of the proposed use. So some of these fees that people get charged are because there's a site plan involved. So if you're bringing someone on your property, that triggers a whole nother level of review in terms of public safety, setback requirements, landscaping, potential traffic, parking. There's just a whole host of things that suddenly come into the review versus something that doesn't require site plan review. So again, we always try and make sure that our fees roughly match what the level of staff and public outreach is for each of these proposed land uses. We also know that if it's going to be contentious, so in my time with Deschutes County, land uses that once were nobody even noticed have now become battle royales. So we've had a lot of contention with our land uses, which then feeds into the complexity of the decision. So now we have a lot of times take a hearings officer deposit for something that in the past we never would have had to take a hearings officer deposit for, because it wouldn't have been controversial. Now, for a variety of reasons, we have a lot of controversy and contention on our land uses. And also sometimes what they're proposing is what we call first impressions. So it might be something that they want to do that isn't explicitly in our code, is kind of described by state statute, OAR. We're kind of like, well, this is analogous to, they want to do B, this is analogous to A and C. We think we can get it through, but it's going to be a little more complex because, again, it's a matter of first impression. An example of that would be the state now allows cideries. Our code doesn't explicitly allow cideries or farm breweries, but we were able to get through those with, is it a commercial use in conjunction with a farm use? Because it's really similar to a winery, which is allowed under state statutes and OARs in our code. And then some smaller scale farm breweries. So one of the solutions to that is, of course, is we could always amend our code to get them explicitly, but we've looked at them as commercial activities in conjunction with a farm use or potentially a home occupation. So we always try and look at, we don't lead with no, we look at, well, here's what we can do under the state system. Here's what we can do under our code, which is consistent with that state system. Can we get you through that door? That's one of the reasons we also have pre-applications, so people aren't spending money needlessly on, what my buddy Will Groves likes to say, we don't want to charge you $5,500 to write you a denial letter. If you want to see what so that works out fairly well. And again, our pre-apps are free. The other thing that I said is site plan review. This is my 5th topic at 30,000 feet. So when you come in, depending on what you're doing, once you're bringing the public onto your property, it triggers a whole bunch of different stuff for building code, septic. Have to look at traffic. Again, we get landscaping. We get, depending where you are, could look at the construction materials and the type of color and hue you can have if you're in a landscape management zone. So there's a whole cascading effect if you need a site plan review versus a use that does not need a site plan review. Access is another one, depending on how many trips your use is going to bring. You may or may not have to do a traffic study. You may need a driveway permit, but it's just, again, another layer of complexity, which then leads to challenges in our fees. The last one I want to talk about out of my 6 at 30,000 feet, and then I'll briefly talk about what the board discussed last week, is that even if we didn't have land use, let's just pretend for a moment we're Idaho. There are still aspects that are going to change the land use patterns you have on the landscape, because you're going to have things such as septic. So let's just say, for instance, that what you're doing is perfectly allowed, but can your septic system handle it? So if you want to open up, say, a bakery or a commercial scale kitchen, your septic may have been for a single family home. And so now you're going to have Todd Cleveland come and look at it and see, is your septic system all right? He's our environmental health division leader. Is your septic all right? Do you need to improve it? You also have to have a place to have a reserve area for your drain field should you, exhaust your current septic. building code, as I said before, there's a difference between an agricultural building and a building you're using for commercial or industrial uses. So once you are going to bring the public onto your property for public safety reasons, we have to look at the state building code. And so now we're looking at construction materials, or looking at fire, we're looking at a whole host of events that you wouldn't have to do if it was just a straight up agricultural use and you weren't doing any commercial.
Just a quick clarification. So that's like, even if the people are going to come on your property but not like access any of the structures, like if it's a farm stand and you have a little picnic table set up or something and your salsa, you still have to do this process.
You're still going through site plan review now.
Okay.
You may not trigger building code if you're not building, if they're not going into a structure, they may not look at it, but generally if they're bringing on there, yeah, we're going to make sure the building is sufficient, or if you may have to retrofit an agricultural building. But so yeah, if you got over a structure of 120 square feet, I think you start bumping the building code.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if the home is not part of, there's the home over here and that's not part of the business, but then there's like the business where the people are going to be accessing is not actually a structure at all, then you don't have to get into the building.
You mean like a roadside farm stand?
Yeah, or it could be by the road, or it could be,
It might depend if you have employees that are in the home. So it's like, what all is being, is the home, is something occurring in the home? Because in some of our home occupations, they happen in an attached building. Others, they can go in the home. So it depends if the home is being used for the business or not. But if it's like a straight standalone, I don't think you get into building code, but our leaving community development director, future county administrator, might know as he.
Well, I was just going to say, even temporary structures, if somebody has a wedding venue that's a business, not a private wedding, that's not regulated. Other than maybe traffic, there's a big issue with that. But when it comes to a temporary structure, the building division is still going to review that, because if it's a commercial venue and that is going to be effectively it's not a structural code, but it's going to be a temporary code, because it could fly away in a big wind. I mean, it's a big tent, exactly. So building, and they are involved in these, particularly in summer, but they can also be sometimes at, like, for example, at Mount Bachelor in the winter, when they had those temporary warming shelters and whatnot at Mount Bachelor in the winter until they built their new lodge. Then our building department is involved in that per state codes.
okay, thank you.
Is there a lower limit though? I mean, if I, for example, wanted to sell flowers from my greenhouse from a farm stand and I had the flowers out on a box for money, do you regulate that?
If it's a business, if it's a pattern of use, if it's a regular ongoing business operation, yes, we would. If it's the garage sale, the lemonade stand, those kinds of things, no, certainly not. Yeah, those one-offs we don't.
People who have roadside libraries, giveaways, that's not a business.
It's not. Those are generally in the public right of way. But
Right, but so the other thing that happens is we have a title 12, I believe, where they have to get a permit to operate in our county right of way. And so there's certain insurance requirements and whatnot, for public safety as well. Obviously, you just don't want people setting things up willy-nilly in the right of way next to most of our roads are higher speed. So you may not need land use approval, but you're still probably gonna need a permit from the county to operate, and then from our right of way.
Could you pull your microphone just a little bit towards you? Yeah, thanks.
That is a difference, isn't it? The other aspect I was going to touch on, besides septic, besides building, there's the demographics. You have lower population density in rural areas. So again, even if there weren't land use controls, there still may be reasons that people aren't going to develop out there. And then also there's traffic. You may have to do a traffic study. You may or may not have to pay transportation system development charges, depending on what your use is and how intense. For farm stands, we give a seasonal break. So there are a host of non-land use reasons that still can affect a rural economic development opportunity. The other thing that we wrestle with in land use, to be honest, is you come in and you say, well, I just want to have agritourism. I just want to have 6 dinners. We're like, okay. And then all of a sudden you want 30 dinners, and then you want 30 dinners and 40 lunches. And then pretty soon we have to say, have you become a restaurant, which isn't allowed. There's one of the more famous LUBA land use cases was the Blueberry Cafe, which is the same thing out in Marion County. I think it was Highway 22, where they started small, just a farm stand, and then pretty soon there are parking people and there's picnic tables, and it's pretty much an al fresco restaurant, and it's without ever getting any proper permitting or reviews. So that's one of the wrestling matches we always have with, again, it's the state code that drives the state rules, and the state administrative rules and state laws drive what we can do. We have to be consistent. We can be more restrictive. We can't be less. So that was kind of the half dozen high points that were in the white paper. In terms of if there's any more questions, let's go on to the board summary.
Questions, commissioners, please, if any? Yes, please, go ahead, Commissioner Altman.
Thanks, Chair. Peter, I have just curiosity, since you just mentioned the blueberry stand that turned into an al fresco restaurant. Do you have any idea of how many people may be operating businesses in the county without this kind of either permit or site plan review? I mean, honestly, I had no idea that this much would be involved. I don't have a business that I do at home like that, but I imagine there are plenty of people, I see box like eggs, put $5 here and take some eggs or whatever. I imagine those people don't know that maybe they should have a permit or anything like that. Do you have any estimate of or guess about?
We're a driven organization, so unless we receive a code enforcement complaint about somebody doing one of these, I have no idea, to be honest.
So on the average county road, there are about 5 such businesses. You can tell just by driving around. You can buy a whole meal on the length of Tumalo Reservoir Road, but in separate pop-up, single-use farm stands, none of which sell blueberries.
Some uses can fall within the farm use definition, like U-Picks. That certainly is a farm use. So there's certainly there's always gray area, and there's always new territory. And I genuinely mean this. One of the great things about agriculture and farming practices is they're always innovating and they're always being entrepreneurial and exploring new ways. And at the same time, they're not always checking with the county planning office first. And we really work closely with them, and it happens fairly regularly. And I would say we have a fantastic relationship with them. We allow, unless I'm mistaken, maybe that's the side race, but every use allowed under state law. Some people don't like that. They think that we're too permissive. We follow all the processes as established by state law, but with more interest in everything that happens in Deschutes County, they become more complicated, more contested. We're a fee-based organization. Not everybody likes that. And you're hearing more about that. And I think the panel that we're going to have in a couple of months with the small farmers, we're going to hear about these really important and great issues. And I think it's going to be an important meeting for us to identify what those issues are and what we can do about them, because there are things that the county can do about them. If the fees are too high and the county chooses to offset, that's a nice way of saying subsidize fees, then that's a decision that the Board of Commissioners can make for certain types of uses or businesses or applications.
So what I was, Nick hit it right on the head in terms of how we interact with state law and state rule. We allow everything that's allowable. Now, some things the state may say is an outright permitted use and we say is a conditional use, but we still allow it. So in my research, I couldn't find anything in the exclusive farm use, those agricultural zones we have, the forestry zones that the state allows that we do not. Everything that the state says you can do, we let happen. Now, the only thing we're different on, like I said, there's some that are a conditional use where under the state it's not outright permitted. But in terms of like not allowing it and being more restrictive, nope, we're as permissible as the state of Oregon lets us be, is kind of it in a nutshell. Yep. So the board's hearing on the 28th, or the work session on the 28th, if you're just can't get to sleep one night, if you go to the 2-hour and 17-minute mark on the board video, I'll start talking again. And I'll also be there with Will Groves, who's a senior planner on the current side and is a practitioner, and Nick's there as well. But so I'll be the one putting you to sleep. But if you want to see what the board has, and more than just my little discussion here, it starts at the 2-hour and 17-minute mark on the board video there.
What was the date again?
That was, I think it was the 28th we did that. Yeah, June 28th. Yeah, it's the afternoon session. So, I followed Kyle there too, so. So some of the questions the board had or comments is they brought up campgrounds and private parks as a possible allowable use. We talked with them, particularly from Will, is that one of the issues with private parks and campgrounds, public campgrounds have to be on a state master plan or local park district master plan before they can be allowed. Private campgrounds are allowable, but typically what they run into are challenges with either septic or water, or a little bit with traffic. Some of it's traffic generation, some of it is the type of vehicles that go into campgrounds, but that's one of the reasons we haven't seen a lot of campgrounds develop in Deschutes County. The other thing that the board talked about is wanting to look at small producers, such as meat packing, how they would be allowed under the various uses. Then you get into ODA. So again, the one thing I want to be clear, just as Kyle mentioned about natural stewardship, there are state agencies that have a role as well. I mean, certainly we do at the local county planning, but also the Oregon Department of Agriculture is involved with a lot of the items that go on with agriculture and commercial kitchens and inspecting and things like that. So it's just not the planning department that's involved. The other thing the board was wondering about, and Nick had alluded to this, is that Commissioner Chang discussed how the board does give money to certain economic development agencies to promote jobs and whatnot. Well, what about spending that money more towards these agrarian entrepreneurs and maybe subsidize some of that, or provide money to that. Board has a fee waiver policy as well, but you have to meet a certain set of circumstances to get that. So that was a general discussion, no decision made by the board, just kind of talking about general ideas. Specialty foods is another option that Chair DeBone brought up in terms of allowing on our land uses. Again, we get a lot of these through the commercial activity in conjunction with the farm use or home occupations. That's how we get to the cideries and the farm breweries that Nick mentioned earlier. We also talked to the board that we're going to have this small farmers panel. So they wanted to hear the recap of that after it happens. We're shooting for early October to do that. One of the things that the board said, well, maybe you want to do a case study or two with one of these small farmers who went through our process and give us a critique. What was the good, the bad, the ugly? So Commissioner Chang kindly forwarded some examples to us that he's heard from the public, and so we may reach out to them to make sure they're on our small farmers panel. And then they said, make sure you talk to the Planning Commission to get thoughts and ideas from the Planning Commission. So here I am. That concludes my summary.
Thank you. Commissioners, thoughts as required, please. Jessica, you're so much larger in real life than the little iPhone image. I'm sure you want to lead off on that.
I'm just digesting what you've said, and I may jump in later, but thank you. I mean, I think this is very interesting and really important. So I'm still processing.
We allow processing. It's an agricultural use.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in general, this is something where it's going to be very helpful to hear, not just from the complainers, but actually from the innovators, as Nick has said, because it's one of those things, again, where you can come up, of course, with a whole range of things that you may want to do and want to support, but having a champion first, it's much better to do it by selection than by persuasion, basically. Commissioners, any other thoughts, comments, please, for Peter, before you rush off to go and look at the 28th of June? What was it, 2 hours and 18 minutes?
Yeah, 2:17. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to miss out the introduction.
I think I really started like 2:18. It's like 50 seconds or something, but yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Peter, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I saw Commissioner Altman put away her second list of questions for you. She's going to bring them up later. We now go to, which actually has come around several times, and it's good to actually have it now, at item 8, campground recreation vehicle parks and manufactured home parks. Particularly timely in that we now have heard that Elon Musk is living in a $50,000 pop-up building that was put up in one day. So technology moves on.
Good evening, Commissioners. For the record, Peter Gutowski, Planning Manager. I'm looking at Ayla. There we go. Perfect timing. So yes, rounding up your eventful meeting tonight is an opportunity to recap the Planning Commission on yesterday's conversation with the Board of County Commissioners concerning their interest in understanding how campgrounds and RV parks and manufactured home parks and some other uses can be entitled here in rural Deschutes County on non-federal lands. And what I've done is I'm just recapping the PowerPoint that was provided. It's about 18 slides, and certainly I'll pause throughout to allow the Planning Commission to engage accordingly. So as I mentioned, this was a request in the spring by the Board of County Commissioners to understand more thoroughly how these specific types of uses can be cited in rural Deschutes County. There's a memorandum that's in your packet that discusses in much more detail than this PowerPoint, the land use requirements, the regulatory obstacles that I think really contribute to deterring future investments for these types of uses in our community. In coordination with Nick, we also felt it was really important to just recap the process for how recreational vehicles are utilized in our county. The Land Conservation and Development Commission very soon will be taking temporary rules related to temporary housing for those that were displaced by last year's wildfires. Those rules are going to become permanent later this month. And then also just alerting the Planning Commission and certainly the Board of County Commissioners to a recent law, House Bill 2006, concerning emergency shelters. All of this, I think, is meeting the intentions by the board to really have a greater understanding of how the rural lands can play a role in addressing the housing crisis that we're experiencing in our region. Admittedly, this is a lot of information, but nonetheless, continuing on, existing conditions. There's a map in your packet that shows where campgrounds and recreational vehicle parks and manufactured mobile home parks are located in our community. I think, as will be highlighted in this presentation, campgrounds and RV parks are really structured and regulated to provide recreational and seasonal use. And I'll get into that more detail. There's some laws that are in place that limit the length of stay in these locations. Alternatively, manufactured mobile home parks are permanent, and they really do serve a certain segment of our community, meaning a low-income housing need. Outside of a recent land use decision that the Board of County Commissioners made just a few months ago for a campground that was approved and finalized, but of course all they have is an entitlement. The existing development that's cited in the memorandum was built well over 40 years ago. And admittedly, given the length of time, I just acknowledge that the land use records in many cases are not as complete as we might want them to be. Just citing the memorandum here that the tables 1 through 3 acknowledge the 4 campgrounds, 7 RV parks, and 16 mobile or manufactured home parks in rural Deschutes County.
So
Please.
I think you probably answered it then. So this is rural Deschutes County. For example, looking at sisters, you're not showing those which are within the incorporated areas, sisters, are you?
Correct. I am just focusing on rural lands that are not under federal control. So you're right. There are a number of RV parks, I suspect a handful of manufactured home parks in our municipalities. And I was talking to the building official this week, and I actually, my understanding is there's some new manufactured home parks being proposed in La Pine. So yeah, we're not identifying those for the purposes of this discussion.
Thank you.
So regulations, it's deliberate, following a theme that, from Peter Russell, who just recapped rural economic development opportunities on not just rural residential lands, but in exclusive farm use zone property. But we have a statewide land use system. We've got administrative rules and statutes that really dictate how these specific uses can be established in rural counties in the state of Oregon. And those regulatory requirements are incorporated into Deschutes County Code, of course. So kicking off with campgrounds. Campgrounds are permitted conditionally in the multiple use agricultural 10 zone, as well in the exclusive farm use zone on those areas that are recognized as non-high value farmland. There are specific standards. This really comes out of state law that require access to outdoor recreation. This is true for exclusive farm use zone property, transportation access, of course, water supply, and sewage disposal. When I was engaging the Board of County Commissioners, I just, again, felt it was important to explicitly highlight the rules coming from at the state level that dictate how campgrounds function. You have to have a minimum of 65% open space. Camp space limitations cannot be less than 1,600 square feet. Each campsite has to have a parking space. There are yards and setbacks. And as I mentioned, there are limitations to visitation to, again, ensure that these are being used as a seasonal or temporary basis. And as noted in the last bullet point, they have to be licensed as a tourist facility. So as I'll talk about later, when we think about regulatory obstacles, I think this does play a role in terms of why we don't see privately initiated campgrounds, because of the fact that it has that seasonality or temporary visitation aspect to it. RV parks, interesting to know, I don't think we have any members of our planning commission that were here at the time, but in approximately 2014, we had an applicant-initiated amendment to expand where RV parks and manufactured home parks could be cited in rural Deschutes County, and an applicant added these 3 bullet points that have locational aspects in relationship to the city of Bend's urban growth boundary. The intent at the time was to, I think, utilize the existing manufactured home park and an RV park that were next to one another to take advantage of some opportunities for expansion. They were never acted upon. And a good question from the Board of County Commissioners were, why just the locational? I understand you were broadening the application. Why weren't they broadened any further beyond the proximity to the Bend urban growth boundary? As Nick may remember, we explicitly alerted those other existing RV and manufactured home parks of this text amendment and the opportunity to participate and potentially introduce friendly amendments to it. We didn't receive any testimony through our effort to ensure that this process received as much public comment as possible. So these are locational factors, again, that would allow a new recreational vehicle park to be cited in rural Deschutes County. They are a conditional use permit, which is noted as well with the campgrounds. And the code also recognizes that expansion of existing RV parks on the same parcel can be permitted as a conditional use as well. Similarly to campgrounds, there are specific standards that apply pertaining to potable water, sewage disposal, limitations on vehicle stays, toilets, showers, and access. And that's just to name a few. This is important to note, just part of existing regulations. Again, I have a slide that talks about the regulatory obstacles, and you'll see why this carries over. The expansion of existing RV park requires that the existing recreational vehicle park be brought up to current code for fire and life safety and for really public health reasons. Many of these parks are decades old, and their access is not necessarily designed for the latest fire apparatus vehicle. Their water supply or water volume to serve this development may be substandard, given the fact that it's been approximately 40 to 50 years. So not to get ahead of the PowerPoint presentation, but this is just worth noting that these uses are very much legal, lawful uses. Some of them are legally non-conforming because the code where some of these RV parks are located wouldn't be allowed today, just based on the zoning and the parcel size. But nonetheless, they have the ability to expand subject to conforming to existing codes, structural or otherwise, dealing with fire, life safety, and environmental health purposes.
Peter,
You're
if
going
I
to see
could
similar themes.
interject one comment.
Absolutely, Commissioner. Sorry, I should have paused.
No problem. I just wanted to indicate I was at the beginning of my involvement with the Planning Commission. This particular case that had come up, I was on the Planning Commission at that point. And again, I just wanted to reiterate your comments about a lot of the discussion of the planning commissioners at that time was all about the fire, life safety, the access, the ability to get fire trucks, et cetera, during that time. So anyway, I just wanted to accentuate that point.
Thank you, Commissioner Swisher. I was tempted to call you out, but I didn't want to be presumptuous, knowing that it was several years ago. But yeah, thank you for reinforcing it. It was a dynamic conversation at the Planning Commission level. There was at least 2 hearings, as I recall, just given the interest to understand the infrastructure requirements to ensure that these types of developments are serving their constituents appropriately.
So yes, I am old, and it's okay to call me out on it.
I would never do that, Commissioner. I would call it a seasoned veteran on our commission, which is wonderful to have given that long-term perspective. So transitioning to manufactured home park regulations, as I was mentioning, similar themes are going to come up, as I just mentioned, with the RV park provisions. Manufactured home parks are permitted conditionally in the multiple use agricultural zone, subject to the same locational requirements that I mentioned earlier that were introduced by applicants. You can expand an existing manufactured home park on the same parcel to conditional use. And interestingly, the code recognizes that those existing manufactured home parks that are in rural residential exception zones can expand as well. Currently, however, the rural residential 10 zone does not recognize the opportunity for new manufactured homes. They, as with campgrounds, as with RV parks, have specific standards that apply to potable water, sewage disposal, and access, among others. And again, if one wants to expand an existing manufactured home park, they're again required to bring up the entire development up to current codes for fire, life safety, and public health.
So I wasn't concentrating on when you dealt with campgrounds. And is that a general requirement for RV park campgrounds and manufactured home parks, that if you expand it, you've got to bring the whole thing up?
Great question for clarification. For campgrounds, that provision is not in place. I think in part because 3 of the 4 campgrounds we have in our community are state parks. So I don't think that they have quite the infrastructure issues that you see that are necessary for RV parks and manufactured home parks.
So presumably then in the categories where that does apply, if they were in place 40 years ago, and therefore, as you said, are likely not to be necessarily up to current code standards, I guess it's not a terribly high margin business. So the appetite, I would imagine, for expanding them, having to do all that work means that one is unlikely to see much interest in expanding existing RV parks and manufactured home parks.
I think it's a great statement, Mr. Chairman. I think there's interest. It's just there are physical limitations. If we had Todd Cleveland here, the manager of our environmental soils division, these uses, their septic systems are admittedly older, and even if you wanted to expand, you're talking about likely upgrading what would be a state permitted wastewater control pollution facility. You have to have reserved drain fields because the drain field has a certain lifespan, and then you want to have a reserve area to ensure that when that one drain field expires, there's a reserve that can be tapped into. And there's truly just not a lot of room to provide that infrastructure. As Commissioner Swisher may recall, there was a mobile home park representative in the area between Bend and Redmond who was acknowledging the challenges and was really interested in exploring ways to acquire a piece of property adjoining the RV park and allowing wastewater to be processed in that adjoining property. And we talked about some of the provisions relating to Goal 11. There are opportunities, I think, to do that, so long as you're not increasing residential densities, but it's not inexpensive. And so those issues, again, it's hard not to talk about the existing regulatory requirements to then acknowledge the regulatory obstacles, but I guess they go hand in hand in this case. So those are real economic and physical limitations to expand that business plan that's in place. Okay, shall I continue? Just taking a pause, commissioners. I realize this is a lot of information being conveyed. Again, we thought it was important to just recap how recreational vehicles can be utilized in rural Deschutes County. Again, I'm not talking about medical hardships, but for a temporary use, recreational vehicles can be used. Essentially, I won't read these 4 bullet points, but the recreational vehicle has to be maintained as a recreational vehicle. It has to, still be licensed by the Department of Motor Vehicles. It has to have, all the requisite elements to ensure that it can be driven. And, the utilities that are attached to it, need to be, as it's stated there, a quick disconnect type of a utility. So there's nothing permanent. And in terms of, trying the temptation to have additions to it, they can't be permanent. You could have a temporary canopy, but you couldn't physically build a carport or an addition to it because that's taking it out of its temporary use opportunity. There's no land use required for a recreational vehicle if you're using it for less than 30 days in any consecutive 60-day period. If you want to use it for a longer period, not to exceed 6 months in any calendar year, then there's a temporary use requirement that ensures that you're coordinating with environmental health for proper sanitation, treatment, that it's being reviewed to make sure it's not in any kind of jurisdictional wetland, things of that sort, again, to ensure that it's compatible on a residential piece of property. What in my overview, I failed to mention that temporary residences, recreational vehicles for a temporary residence are available on individual lots that don't have a dwelling. So that's a key point to make. And so where we see these is in southern Deschutes County, where we have those high groundwater lots that are incapable of being utilized for a dwelling. Nonetheless, there's economic use that needs to be made available on the property, and recreational vehicle from a temporary standpoint is a use that of course is permissible in all 36 counties. But again, they're subject to these types of provisions. Okay, transitioning just to the Land Conservation and Development Commission's temporary rules relating to the 2020 wildfires. There are rules in place that allow those affected jurisdictions, cities and or counties to be able to accommodate interim housing opportunities, whether they're shelters or recreational vehicles be placed on residential properties, all to accommodate the displacement that we saw that was fairly widespread in Santiam Canyon, the McKenzie River Canyon, and Southern Oregon to provide shelter for Oregonians. These are rules that will be permanent, as I mentioned at the front end of this presentation. It allows for, again, temporary housing outside of urban areas for a period of 36 months. There's a process to extend that, I think for an additional 2-year period. Again, the uses that are temporary range from campgrounds to temporary residential uses and shelters that can accommodate those people that have been affected. I said, yeah, 2 years, but that's the same thing. A county can grant 2 additional 12-month extensions by demonstrating that it remains necessary. So when I was engaging the Board of County Commissioners yesterday, acknowledging that there's these state rules that are somewhat limiting to take advantage or try to address our housing crisis, I try to emphasize that the board may want to consider, as you contemplate whether or not it's appropriate to begin discussing some legislative concepts, whether it's in the short session in 2022 or of the full session in 2023, that it may be worth a conversation about this housing crisis, to think about interim housing solutions as a stopgap measure for people to land on their feet and position themselves for more permanent housing. So again, I think this is a conversation that likely will continue, but I think there's a lot to be learned about how the Oregon's land use program, through the leadership of Land Conservation and Development Commission, how they recognized a need and established what will be permanent rules to provide temporary housing. And I don't know if you need a natural hazard to acknowledge we have a housing crisis today in our state that may warrant a robust conversation about other temporary rules that, again, can provide some transition to ensure that people have a safe place to stay as they transition, again, with the goal of having more permanent housing.
Does the county have any code relating to, I guess, in general terms, cooling centers? I mean, if this trend of heat shock impacting the homeless community, how are they regulated or licensed, or can you just put one up anywhere because it's a temporary emergency?
It's a really good question. Of course, the issue has come up for emergency shelters in the winter when we get one of those big Arctic front or low pressure systems that sweeps into our community. I don't know if there's specific regulations on our books, but I know the county with its city partners and the law enforcement and other entities rally to establish shelters at certain locations to ensure that people are safe, that are vulnerable, again, when the climate is very, very cold. But do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just volunteered at one the weekend before last, and it was at a church. The other one was at the Shepherd's House. So I think the ones that have been approved recently or being utilized are commercially approved structures that have adequate parking and space and have other restrooms. They've been approved as commercial facilities that have been then transitioned to serving as. It's a great question as cooling centers, and they're generally. Just working with the people that come in. I mean, they're people that need services. So, in a rural location, it's probably less likely to be as helpful as near services, particularly transportation and food services, medical services.
Normally, I would have actually thought it was really an urbanized area challenge and solution. But, if you look at where the urban growth boundary currently is, for example, Roble Road, and you look along, I've forgotten the name of the road, but opposite to Lowe's, I mean, there's really quite a community of homeless people living there now. And I just wonder whether, in fact, those are the sorts of people who might have fallen so far outside the system that they might not utilize those, So in other words, could you put one more effectively, either for warming or cooling, because it looks like a year-round thing, to have it locally? But yeah, okay, thank you.
That's a great question because it's going to lead right into Peter's last topic.
Yeah, and it does transition to House Bill 2006 relating to emergency shelters. So it allows, and this slide focuses predominantly on, of course, the rural lands, but it allows emergency shelters to be located outside urban growth boundaries in rural residential exception areas. So again, a quick reminder, rural residential exception areas are rural residential 10 zones, multiple use agricultural 10 zones, urban area reserve 10 zones, and there's a legacy zone just near Juniper Ridge called suburban residential 2.5 zones. Really, it's the rural residential exception of multiple use agricultural 10 zones that would be contemplated for emergency shelters. There's a requirement that it's operated by a legitimate entity, whether it's a local government or a religious organization, a religious entity, or a housing works, a housing authority, or a legitimate nonprofit corporation that can demonstrate they have a minimum of 2 years experience being in this role. The bill, I wanted to point out to the board that it does make it easier for cities to approve, and I was telling Nick about this meeting before the meeting started, to approve parking lots where people can utilize their recreational vehicles in an area that's suitable for transitional housing. And then the second part to that is there's some significant funding opportunities to help organizations that want to create shelters. One of the questions that came up as soon as I finished this third bullet point is, what does it mean to have a shelter? And it requires, in section 2 and section 3, it speaks to a structure and has to conform to the building code. So it would be something like, if you've been reading the Veterans Village, which the county had a huge role in providing the land in coordination with the city, with essentially, again, veterans organization. So it's definitely has more of a permanence to it. The board did spend some time, and you could understand why, and it came up with rural economic development is, we think about temporary. Sometimes you want to just put up a huge tent or a yurt, to try to see if that would be promising. But this bill did not speak to that. Again, having more permanence is associated with the structure. Okay, regulatory obstacles. I've already kind of just in this presentation, similar to the board, you end up just alerting the audience to some of the challenges. Campgrounds, and the same will be true with RV parks, and is there, because they're conditional uses, they're subject to general and specific compatibility requirements. And what the board experienced by agreeing to hear a hearings officer appeal of a campground, they witnessed firsthand the concerns that a neighbor had of a campground, given its location, the adjoining use, which was essentially had some agricultural uses, as I recall, noise, and just concerns about compatibility given its location. And so that's a factor when you think about, again, a use that we've made the decision that campgrounds and RV parks, because of their intensity, should be reviewed from a compatibility standpoint at a case-by-case basis to ensure that it's suitable, to accommodate that use in relationship to adjoining uses. So, as we're well aware, if you have a committed, dedicated opponent, they can appeal a decision throughout the local process and ultimately to the Land Use Board of Appeals. The infrastructure piece is not lost on this as well. again, they have to provide a suite of what I'll call amenities. I won't list it, but it's shown on the slide. This is required per state law. So you're talking about significant upfront costs to ensure that the campground can function appropriately. One of the things that I didn't mention to the board, but I'll mention to you, just because I know how interested the Planning Commission is about water resources, water supply, water conservation, is one couldn't just drop an exempt domestic well to serve a campground. You're going to need a what I'll call a quasi-municipal well, and that's going to require obtaining, a groundwater mitigation permit, which basically means you're going to have to buy a senior water right that's commensurate with the use that you need for a campground to ensure that consumptive uses is the same. And buying a senior water right is not going to be inexpensive. And we're not even talking about wastewater treatment. So that's a factor as well. That again, I think demonstrate why we haven't seen a physically constructed new campground in over 40 years. The same thing is with RV parks that I mentioned. They have the obligation again to provide the same types of what we'll call amenities. Of course, they have limitations on stay. And it's that expansion piece, I think, that comes into play that I echoed at the front end, where if you want to expand an existing RV park, bringing that whole park up to code is just cost prohibitive. Manufactured home parks, unfortunately, I didn't lead with the previous comments that I made for campgrounds and RV parks. The real hindrance for new manufactured home parks is you have to meet the density requirements of state law. And so because these are permanent dwellings and state law only requires you're only allowed to have one dwelling on one piece of property, you can't essentially, if you wanted to establish more than one dwelling on a 10-acre piece of property, you would have to get an exception to Goal 14, which is urbanization. And that is a difficult provision of state law to justify. You basically have to demonstrate that this type of use is not suitable in an urban environment, which would be impossible to make. And so
the Veterans Village is within the urban growth boundaries.
Yeah, it's within city limits of Bend. Yes, it is. And so assuming you could, you wanted to demonstrate that this need was necessary and that this specific type of use and maybe the design wasn't warranted or couldn't be accommodated in the city, well, you're still dealing with significant infrastructure improvements. And then I just wanted to highlight again, to the extent you had an existing manufactured home park and you wanted to expand it, you're subject to those same challenges of bringing that entire development up to current code. Recreational vehicles, again, circling back, as I mentioned on the front end, the recreational vehicle as a temporary use has to be maintained as a vehicle and licensed with the Department of Motor Vehicles. The moment you want to make that permanent, the building codes come into play. You have to have a foundation. It has to be structurally reinforced. You're going to need electrical permits. It's going to be evaluated to ensure from a fire and life safety standpoint that it is safe to occupy. If our building official or assistant building official, Randy Scheid and Chris Gracia were here, they will tell you that in the building official community, there are often cases where someone's living in a recreational vehicle permanently during the winter. There's a snow load, the recreational vehicle collapses, and there's a tragedy. And similarly, just throughout the year, there's always inevitably a case where there's a circumstance where the RV wasn't properly ventilated, they had an alternative heating source, there was carbon monoxide issues, things of that sort. So this is the primary reason why you don't see recreational vehicles being used permanently. And it's the big challenge for tiny homes, right? Tiny homes is such an incredible opportunity, and Europe, I think, has addressed it in ways that is different than the United States. But as of right now, tiny homes, because they're considered a vehicle, it's difficult, if not impossible, to cite more than one on a piece of property. And our team in the community development department probably at least once a week deals with questions about tiny homes because they are popular and novel, but the codes themselves make it difficult, if not impossible, to cite them on rural land. So I kind of
Can I just ask it,
yeah,
Peter?
please.
So a mobile home park is an RV park, just by another name, or is that something?
A mobile home or a manufactured home park are permanent.
Right.
Those
Okay.
are permanent.
So it's okay. Manufactured home is.
Yeah, I mean, mobile and manufactured. I'm using.
Yeah.
Synonymously, truly, what we're seeing existing are mobile home parks. These are very, very old mobile home parks, but they have a foundation. They're not.
So they're not truly mobile.
They're not mobile. It's just
Yeah.
the terminology.
Yeah.
So the message that I wanted to convey to the board is they may want to consider starting to have some preliminary conversations amongst themselves to talk about changes to state law. You know, these were just two ideas that I had. You know, I think one could explore. There might be real reasons to think about citing manufactured home parks, allowing them to occur, ignoring the density limitations in certain locations in rural counties. Again, ensuring that they had proper access, had adequate water and wastewater utilities, but you know, they do serve a segment of our community, and I thought it was worth at least introducing that concept to the Board of County Commissioners. Similarly, as I mentioned with the temporary, soon to be permanent rules relating to those that have been affected by the 2020 wildfires, we have a housing crisis in our state. And, you know, one could easily make an argument that the same type of measures that LCDC is going to adopt in a permanent fashion should be explored in our state for those that are struggling to provide some transitional housing, again, as a means to get those into a more permanent situation. If I may, Commissioners, one thing that I want to share with you that I mentioned to the board, and it's at the previous slide pertaining to RVs. I wanted to let both bodies know that Deschutes County has seen a greater increase in requests for using RVs for those that have a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And while I didn't incorporate it in a PowerPoint slide, I wanted to, I'll share with the Planning Commission that Deschutes County recognizes the importance of that situation. The American Disabilities Act really changes the whole paradigm from, you know, instead of acknowledging these regulatory limitations, it's about how to get to yes. It's about making reasonable accommodations on a case-by-case basis. And we are doing so in coordination with our entire team and building and safety, environmental health within coordinated services and legal counsel, of course, to address those circumstances. And recreational vehicles as a temporary use, again, to get these residents of ours, these neighbors of ours in our county, a more permanent solution. So I think that I wanted to mention that to you. So I think that's the I'm sorry, that's the last slide. And I know this was a lengthy conversation, but there's a lot of information there. The Board of County Commissioners is interested in continuing the conversation. I think they want to hear more about, I think, some of the challenges that are occurring with existing mobile home parks, some of the challenges and opportunities with existing recreational vehicle parks. And I know one commissioner is very interested in campgrounds what I highlighted in the PowerPoint presentation, and I need to make the correction now, is campgrounds can also occur in those areas that are zoned open space and conservation. That those areas occur. There are some areas that exist that are zoned that way between Bend and Redmond. They're owned by Deschutes County. They're owned by the state of Oregon. Anyway, we have one commissioner that I think is interested in exploring potential campground opportunities on lands that the county owns. I think with an idea that it could help provide some temporary housing opportunities and possibly taking some of the pressure off of the dispersed camping that we see on public lands. But that's a conversation that is just in its infancy.
That would be for temporary seasonal use.
It would be. It would only be temporary and seasonally.
So your American for Disabilities and the RV argument I find very compelling. That's not been applied to these tiny homes then, has it not? Or could it be?
The tiny homes are subject, because they're recreational vehicles, are subject to the same limitations. Now, cities have far more latitude. And if they want, just like they could create, and I think some cities have created tiny home parks, right. Or tiny home parks on one parcel or lot. We're limited by just the state land use system because of if it was going to be for a manufacturer, if they wanted to make them permanently, they're considered a dwelling. Certainly, one could try to establish a tiny home recreational vehicle park, but they would be subject to the provisions that I've highlighted this evening.
Getting to tiny homes, there's really two options. We've told people, as people have inquired about, can I have a tiny home on my property? We'll ask a question. Do you have a dwelling on your property today? Yes. Well, then no, you can't. If you have a vacant piece of property, you can build whatever size of home you want, as long as it meets the state building codes. If it has a foundation that meets the state building codes, you can have a tiny home. Now, that's one kind of tiny home. The other kind of tiny home is a tiny home on wheels. That's an RV. And so but we receive these questions regularly. If people can have one or not, and how many, and all of those questions. And the answer is actually pretty straightforward.
So could somebody use either an RV or a tiny home on a property that's where the primary dwelling has been destroyed by fire and they are in the process of rebuilding, or do you?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's vacant until the county then recognizes the new building there.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, one can use an RV, even if it wasn't destroyed. Today, you can use an RV as a temporary home while building.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Commissioners, I think that was a good discourse from Peter. Let's take some questions. I suspect it's probably not a topic that, at least today, we're going to have much discussion on. Please.
I want to say that I think this is a really important issue, and I wish that I had more suggestions to solve this, but just to draw attention to a couple different things. There's been lots of discussion lately about a worker shortage that we're having here in our county and our cities. Lots of places can't get staff for jobs that are like, minimum wage jobs, or even not minimum wage jobs, but maybe aren't extremely high paying jobs. And I don't have any data to support this, but one theory is that maybe people moved away during the pandemic or moved in with family and aren't able to find housing coming back, or maybe people aren't able to afford housing here. And so I think that's going to have an increasing impact on our community as our housing prices go up and we don't have people to do the jobs that come at every different socioeconomic level. So talking about doing whatever we can to increase affordable housing, I think is important, but it really does seem that our hands may be tied here in the county and that issue might just be a city issue. But the other thing that's happening from a citizen perspective of somebody who does live in RR10 is that many people are just going right ahead and having multiple RVs on their properties or having sort of impromptu RV parks. And I think my concern as a citizen, again, our hands are tied, but my concern is that those impromptu RV parks aren't really, I mean, people may have the very best of intentions ever, but they may not understand all of the different things that need to be attended to when you have, 5, 6 RVs on 10 acres. Maybe the board will be able to have some of these discussions about state collaborating with some things about interim housing. I suspect that, if there are people that live in my area that are doing this, they're probably doing it because of completely, really kind-hearted reasons. Like maybe a relative is homeless or they don't have a place to live, and they say, just come park your RV on my property. And then another relative or maybe a friend, or I don't know that people are looking at it as a business so much as just a way of supporting people that they care about, that they don't want to see living in an unsafe situation. So I don't have, like I said, I don't have any data necessarily to support that, but giving people the benefit of the doubt, I think there may be a lot of that going on. And also, people that work here need a place to live. So yeah, wish I had more to suggest in terms of solutions.
I think, to your point about who is affected, I think it's all the way up and down the scale, because people, for example, who are in medical jobs, nurses, clinical assistants at the beginning of their careers, I think have the same challenge. And so in a way, it's actually threatening our ability to provide vital services as a whole county, the incorporated areas included. Commissioners, any other comments or questions for Peter, please? Thank you. Seeing none, if I could this week start with the Planning Commission. So we're looking at item 9 now. Any comments or updates? Steve, what about your housing association? I'm sure you want to bring us up to speed.
Well, we are
Please.
going to have our next meeting very soon, and we're still discussing wildfires and accessory dwelling units. So in any event, by the way, they're illegal in Tollgate. But what I want to talk about tonight is 2 things. My own scheduled next meeting, I'll be in the Portland area, but because of Zoom, I'll be able to participate. And I think that's one of the technological things that has happened during the pandemic that gives public and planning commissioners and staff the ability to participate, even though you're in a remote position. But the last comment I want to make is that I do want to start attending meetings in person, but I still have several pragmatic and simplistic kind of questions. I'm still not exactly sure the protocols. Do we need to let staff know that we're going to come to the meeting as opposed to Zoom in? What are the masks? I didn't see masks, but if we had visitors in the room, should we have masks to be able to put on? Gee, do I need to bring my laptop so I can see the people on Zoom and stuff, or can I see those when I'm sitting in the room? I mean, some of that nitty gritty stuff doesn't need to be answered at this minute, but maybe if Peter or Nick or somebody could just do a 2-second, and I know this landscape has changed so dramatically over the past several months, but if we could just get a little, so you want to come back to the meeting, here's what you need to know kind of memo would be helpful.
And I think in terms of being able to, you certainly don't have to bring your laptop. Although, as you know, 3 meetings ago, we did do it all with just one laptop, but that just shows you how flexible we are, I guess, as a county. The setup here is very good indeed. I think the recovery from having social distancing is going to be very slow. I think from a personal point of view, I would prefer if people let staff know that they're going to attend, but attendance is completely open, both for the public and also certainly for members of the commission. And I think, I don't know if you heard Anthony Fauci on the radio this evening as I was driving in. He was talking about the likelihood of what's happening over the next 3 or 4 months. I mean, I think at the present time, the assumption is if you're vaccinated, you're protected. If you're not vaccinated, then you should wear a mask for your own personal protection. As a courtesy last time, when Commissioner Crawford was with us here, we had one person in the room that wasn't vaccinated who declared that actually up front. And so we all wore masks as a courtesy. If we could continue doing that, it would be very helpful, but it's not a requirement. And certainly I'm sure Peter and or Nick will make sure that a memo gets put out. What I can say though, sitting here is incredibly cold. The county is clearly going to be the last institution to increase its cold temperature. I don't know, Commissioner Kiris, how on earth you're surviving there? I'm
Cold adapted. I swam in the lakes and rivers all winter. So
okay, well, short of that, we can get you a lake if you need to cold adapt before you come in. Any other questions, comments before I hand it over to, please, Commissioner Altman? Thank you.
I just wanted to, I had sent the commissioners actually a thank you about this. I was very grateful that they decided to essentially ban fireworks on the 4th of July. You know, I could hear them in the places they were meant to be heard, and I didn't hear them all over the neighborhood, and my dogs were very happy about that, and I'm sure a lot of other people's dogs, and also veterans were probably also happy about that. So I thought that was a really bold decision. I really appreciated it. It was very peaceful and pleasant 4th of July.
I think it was very much reinforced by the Redmond experience, which I think caught everybody's attention. And be interesting to see how proactive we're going to be as a community if, as seems likely, this is the beginning of a new way of living, basically, in terms of the summer heat and the water deprivation. Commissioner Crawford, any comments?
I really don't have anything to add to this evening's meeting. It was full of information, and I appreciate that. Like everyone else, I was trying to stay cool. I will say that last week I was down at Lake Shasta in the drought, which lake's down 130 feet, on a houseboat, watching 2 fires around us, and going and coming back, not being able to go down Highway 97, have to go up I-5 and then come over. So yeah, heat's an issue, drought's an issue. We better get on board.
Yeah, amen to that.
And a comment to Steve Swisher bringing up the water issue. My granddaddy always told me it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. So bring it up as much as possible.
But
That's
Steve, that's metaphorical. We won't grease you down. I think actually you only do that if you go into cold lakes. Peter, any comments, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. A couple of things. I just want to highlight the July 22nd agenda and then talk briefly about kind of what lies ahead in August. As you know, you have a public hearing to take testimony on the marijuana amendments pertaining to retail hours, as well as potential changes to annual inspections. I wanted to get the Planning Commission's input if you were interested in continuing the conversation about hemp. Adam Smith is going to be on vacation that day, but if the commission is interested, the conversation could continue. Again, the board is welcoming, really looking forward to the Planning Commission's observations or recommendations about this industry and how it relates to land use. So that is an option if you want to discuss on the 22nd. Of course, we will, in the memorandum, if you just chose that you wanted to continue it, to have it on that date, we would recap the land use obstacles, in terms of regulating this industry. But that's not the focal point. But we would ensure that you're reminded of right to farm and Measure 49. So would appreciate input on whether or not you want that scheduled.
So it would be advantageous if we could have Adam Smith attend. He and I had a sidebar conversation afterwards I hadn't expected that he would be A, attending, and B, raising the issue that he raised. And unfortunately, it happened almost at the end of the meeting. And I think it was a very important issue, and in many ways actually would lead us towards a final conclusion much more definitively. So, commissioners, unless you feel we should go ahead anyway without Adam's input, I mean, if you remember the question that he asked, I think was like almost 8:30 in the evening or something like that. And we didn't actually dig into it in depth because basically I said, oh, well, I think that's probably something the board is going to deal with. But I think it probably was not the correct response. I was simply blindsided by that. So can we delay until we have Adam?
There's certainly no rush, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
I'll just move that to August.
But the interest, I think, is there. I think in the end, actually, I wasn't necessarily that persuaded that it would actually raise as many issues as it did. And certainly the people who you got together for the panel were really very, very good indeed. I mean, they stayed with us the whole time. And I certainly learned a lot of things I didn't know beforehand.
Great. So we'll move the hemp conversation to August 12th. The other two items, and they'll be blended for the 22nd, is an update on Senate Bill 391, the rural accessory dwelling unit legislation, and Senate Bill 762 that's dealing with wildfire mitigation. The Board of County Commissioners is getting debriefed on these two laws, and they actually overlap because of requirements for mapping in the state of Oregon, those areas that are in high or extreme areas for the risk of wildfire. So I don't know if you've been alerted to, but our ability to amend our codes and implement Senate Bill 391 pertaining to the rural accessory dwelling unit legislation is going to be put on hold because we need to understand which areas in our county are recognized as higher extreme risk for wildfire. So similar to today's presentations, I foresee Tanya and Kyle, it will list them either back to back, but what will really occur with the permission of the chair is to elevate them up at the same time, which is what's going to happen next week. And you're certainly, of course, welcome to watch that interaction with the board, but we certainly want to debrief the Planning Commission on those two pieces of legislation. So August 12th, we've talked about at least having a hemp conversation. And then I wanted to just alert the board that Nick and I are not going to be here on August 26th. Nick I think has some vacation plans before his transition to county administrator. And I'm escorting my daughter to college as an incoming freshman. So we're heading back east. She has accepted to go to the University of Vermont in Burlington. So it's an opportunity for my wife and I to kind of see her off and see parts of New England. So we were just wanting to get Planning Commission direction if that was okay to cancel that meeting and just have one meeting in August and then reconvene in September.
I believe everybody would concur with that. Yeah.
Okay. See a thumbs up from Commissioner Crawford as well. Great. That's all I had, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
And you may not have actually wanted to mention the fact that you have a spare bedroom coming. The accommodation shortage is so great, you'll have phone calls waiting for you. Can I still call you Nick?
Yeah, that's fine. So Peter and I coordinated on the first part of of our comments, and the other question.
May I just say, on behalf of all of us, very, very many congratulations. We're really looking forward to seeing the county hit new highs under your leadership as the head administrator. We know just how important a position it is, and also just how timely the transition would be. And I'm sure Tom is very pleased to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do just have, after tonight, 2 Planning Commission meetings remaining. Although I may be walking down the hall late on a Thursday evening and not be able to risk to pop in and say hello or not be disruptive.
You
Of
have only
course,
2 meetings left. You could actually start providing food for us then in that case. It's not going
Well,
to be that expensive.
that's where I'm going next. So a couple pieces. One is I expect by your next meeting, and so Commissioner Swisher was asking, does he have to bring a laptop? So Commissioner Swisher, you haven't been here for some time, and so you haven't seen the room reconfigured. And our Vice Chair Curious is seeing it this evening for the first time to see that there are monitors on up front at the dais. So you don't have to bring anything. They're right there, provided and available for you. I do expect at your next meeting on the 22nd, we will have more capacity for more people in the room. I started to coordinate with Sharon Keith, the board's recording secretary. She really manages all operations with this room, and she's seeking direction from county administration at this point on what the gradual reopening will continue to look like. So for those of you that attend, I expect there could be some minor changes then. What Peter and I have started to talk about is your first meeting in August. If you're comfortable, if that meeting would be to begin the pre-meeting meals again. And again, by that point, maybe we have even more capacity. I don't know when everything's going to return to normal, but we're expecting the first meeting in August. We'll also have Chanel, whom you have not yet met, who is preparing your meeting minutes. She would begin to attend your meetings in person and help with the logistics. So the pre-meeting meals, if you're comfortable with that. Of course, we would still provide the Zoom, the remote meeting participation, which gets back to, I think, was Commissioner Swisher's question as well, and our chair's comment. Yes, we will need to then begin to have a regular occurrence, likely with Chanel reaching out to the commissioners, or I think Peter's actually having Tanya to begin to work on the Planning Commission agendas. Chanel, Peter, or Tanya will need to coordinate with the commission on, are you attending, number one, number two, are you attending in person or remotely, so that we can all plan accordingly. So that's going to likely be a new normal come next month in August. So more details to come. And we're trying to be in alignment with the Board of Commissioners so that our residents, they have predictability when they choose to attend a meeting either in person or remotely. Any questions about any of that? But
Do you have any updates for us on the MT South County position?
that was my very next update. Thank you you're ahead of me. That position closes this weekend, although I think it's officially going to be open until filled, because we don't have the candidates that maybe the county hopes, or we don't have any candidates. But it closes this Sunday. So once again, anybody that's watching or any of you, please share that information with anybody else in the community. I'll coordinate with Whitney tomorrow to see if we can do one more quick blast to get that out, because that position has now been out for 3 more weeks. So that was exactly my next update, and I think that is my. Oh no, I've got one more update. Just my last update is that my hope with my transition. Not my hope, but I will appoint an interim community development director, likely the week of August 9th. And then there'll be a bit of overlap. Of course, I'll be available for coordination, et cetera. My first day as the next county administrator will be September 1st. Everything is finalized now. Tom is county administrator until September 30th. So I know he gets questions occasionally of when is the transition occurring, et cetera. So just so everybody is clear with that. So
You're from what date?
So my first day will be September 30th. We will have a 30-day overlap. And so my hope would be then, and the reason I suggest August 9th is I'm going to coordinate with the Human Resources Department and our Deputy County Administrator, Eric Kropp. If we have internal candidates for the position, what are the pros and cons about appointing either a candidate to the interim position, or is that an unfair advantage? And does that then spoil the recruiting and selection process? Is it better to have another candidate, keep the candidate, and keep the interim director, the interim director? So we just want to talk about those pros and cons before we make that decision. But for your August 12th meeting, prior to your August 12th meeting, we'll have that announcement to make. And then again, we'll certainly include at least a couple of planning commissioners. We don't obviously want to have a quorum, can't have a quorum involved in that selection process. And that is my final update this evening. Peter covered the others. Big Board of Commissioners meeting on July 14th, talking about rural ADUs and wildfire. I'm really, really proud of our team. We set out an ambitious agenda to talk about the natural resources stewardship position, the rural economic development and the forthcoming hemp panel, and then housing through the campgrounds, RV, and manufactured home parks. 3 really big, meaty topics, a ton of information. By the end of the fiscal year, we accomplished that. And now here we are talking about the Planning Commission, 3 of the biggest issues that our county is facing and will continue to face. And these white papers are really the starting point or the continuing point for each of these discussions. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Seeing none, and it being almost 8:30, I will adjourn this meeting and thank you for your participation and wish you a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.